The story of the Russian Empire begins long before the word Russia existed. It begins in the forests and river valleys of Eastern Europe, where trade routes linked the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and where Slavic tribes lived alongside Finnic, Baltic, and steppe peoples. In this environment, a new political order emerged, one that would eventually evolve into the foundation of the Russian state. But it began as something far more fragile, a loose network of towns, traders, and princes known as Kievan Rus. By the 9th century, these river routes had become the lifeblood of a growing exchange between Northern Europe and Byzantium. Slavic communities clustered around river forts, while Norse traders and warriors, known as Varangians, traveled south along the Dnieper River carrying furs, wax, honey, and slaves. One of these Varangians, a leader named Rurik, established control over the town of Novgorod around the year 862. After his death, his successors, often called the Rurikid princes, extended their influence southward. By the end of the century, the center of power had moved to the city of Kiev, a thriving hub along the trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Kievan Rus was not a nation in the modern sense. It was a federation of principalities connected by kinship, trade, and allegiance to a ruling dynasty. The Grand Prince of Kiev stood at the top, but his authority depended on balancing the interests of other princes and local elites. Over time, this delicate structure would produce both unity and conflict. Still, in its early centuries, Kievan Rus grew into one of the most influential states of medieval Europe. The real transformation came under Prince Vladimir the Great, who ruled from the late 10th century. Around the year 988, Vladimir made a decision that would define the spiritual and cultural identity of the region for the next millennium. He adopted Christianity from Byzantium. The choice was not only religious, but deeply political. Aligning with the Byzantine Empire gave Kievan Rus diplomatic prestige and access to the wider Christian world. It also offered a unifying faith for a land divided by tribes and languages. The story of Vladimir's conversion is told in the medieval Primary Chronicle, a mix of history and legend. According to this source, Vladimir sent envoys to observe different religions. When they witnessed the splendor of the Christian service in Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, they reported back, "We did not know whether we were in heaven or on earth." Whatever the truth of that tale, Vladimir's baptism marked a turning point. Churches were built, priests arrived from Byzantium, and written culture spread as Slavic scribes began to use the Cyrillic alphabet. Kiev became not just a trading center, but a cultural and religious capital. Under Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, who ruled in the early 11th century, Kievan Rus reached its height. Yaroslav codified laws in the Russkaya Pravda, Russian justice, promoted literacy, and married his children into the royal families of Europe. Under his rule, Kiev rivaled many Western capitals in size and wealth. The city's cathedral of St. Sophia, with its golden domes, became a symbol of this flourishing civilization. But the political structure that supported this prosperity was fragile. Power was hereditary, but divided among the many sons and grandsons of each ruler. Over time, this led to disputes and civil wars. After Yaroslav's death, rival princes fought over control of Kiev, while local centers such as Novgorod, Vladimir, and Suzdal asserted independence. The unity that had once defined Kievan Rus began to splinter. External pressures added to the strain. From the steppe came the nomadic Pechenegs, and later the Cumans or Polovtsians, who raided southern territories. From the west, Poland and Hungary expanded their influence. Still, even amid this fragmentation, the Orthodox Church provided a common identity and a link between the divided principalities. By the early 13th century, however, a far greater danger approached from the east. In the distant steppes of Central Asia, a new power was rising, the Mongols. United under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol armies swept across Eurasia with unprecedented speed and coordination. In the early 1230s, their scouts appeared near the Volga River, defeating a coalition of Rus' princes at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1237. The Rus' princes underestimated the scale of what they faced. That first encounter was devastating, but not yet final. The Mongols withdrew temporarily, only to return a few years later in force. In 1237, under the leadership of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongols launched a full-scale invasion. City after city fell. Ryazan was burned, Vladimir was destroyed, and in 1240, Kiev itself, once the mother of Rus's cities, was sacked after a brutal siege. Chroniclers described its streets littered with corpses and its churches in ruins. Few cities survived untouched. The Mongol conquest marked a rupture in Eastern European history. For nearly 2 centuries, most of the Rus lands would live under the dominance of the Mongol Golden Horde. The princes paid tribute and were confirmed in power only with the Khan's approval. Some historians have called this period the Tatar yoke, emphasizing the burden of foreign rule. Yet it was not only destruction. The Mongols maintained order along the vast trade routes of Eurasia, allowing goods and ideas to move between China, Persia, and Europe. Rus's princes, who adapted to this system, particularly those in the rising northern centers, would eventually use it to their advantage. The devastation of Kiev shifted the balance of power permanently. The city never regained its former prominence. In its place, new centers emerged farther north, away from the Mongol heartlands. Among them, the Principality of Moscow would prove the most enduring. Initially just one of many small towns, Moscow's rulers became skillful intermediaries between their people and the Mongol Khans. They collected tribute, expanded territory, and slowly consolidated authority over rival princes. Out of the ruins of Kievan Rus, a new political order was forming, one more centralized, more autocratic, and eventually more ambitious. The Mongol invasion also left a lasting mark on governance and culture. The princes of the future Russia learned from the Mongols the importance of strict administration, census-taking, and organized taxation. Military service and loyalty to a single ruler became central principles. Even the practice of calling rulers autocrats or tsars echoed the Khan's authority. At the same time, the Orthodox Church, spared from direct persecution, became a stabilizing force and a guardian of national identity. When the Mongols destroyed Kiev and the southern cities, the political heart of the Rus's world moved north. It was there, in the dense forests and river valleys around the upper Volga, that new centers of power began to grow. Among them, one small settlement would rise from obscurity to dominate all others, the town of Moscow. Over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, Moscow transformed from a minor principality into the foundation of a new Russian state. This transformation was not sudden, nor was it inevitable. It was built through careful diplomacy, calculated alliances, military strength, and religious legitimacy. In the early decades of Mongol rule, the princes of the Rus's principalities had no choice but to submit to the Golden Horde. The Mongol Khans demanded tribute and absolute loyalty. The princes were permitted to govern their own territories, but only with the Khan's approval, granted through a formal charter known as a Yarlik. To receive it, they had to travel to the Horde's capital on the lower Volga, perform acts of obedience, and offer gifts. In this system of dependency, the Khans used the local rulers to collect taxes and maintain order, avoiding the need for direct administration. For the Rus's princes, it was a humiliation, but also an opportunity. Those who could maintain the Khan's favor gained a powerful advantage over their rivals. Moscow's early rise was tied to this dynamic. The city's location along the Moscow River gave it access to trade routes linking the Volga basin with the lands of the north. It was protected by forests and marshes, making it defensible from raids. More importantly, its princes learned to manage the delicate balance between subservience to the horde and authority over neighboring lands. The first key figure was Ivan I, often called Ivan Kalita or Ivan the Moneybag. He ruled from the early 14th century and was known for his wealth, shrewdness, and loyalty to the Khan. When the horde faced rebellion in other parts of Rus, Ivan remained a faithful ally. In return, the Khan granted him the title of Grand Prince of Vladimir, giving him the right to collect tribute from other principalities. Ivan used this privilege to expand Moscow's influence. He acted as the Khan's trusted tax collector, forwarding payments promptly and keeping a share for his own treasury. His prudent management of money and politics made Moscow richer than its rivals. But Ivan's success was not based on submission alone. He also cultivated the Russian Orthodox Church, whose authority and wealth were rising during this period. In the early 1430s, the Metropolitan of the Russian Church moved his seat from Vladimir to Moscow. That decision gave the city immense prestige. It became the spiritual as well as the political center of the northern Rus' lands. The princes of Moscow now stood not only as loyal servants of the Khan, but also as protectors of the faith. Over the following generations, Moscow's rulers continued to consolidate power. Ivan's grandson, Dmitry Donskoy, who ruled in the second half of the 14th century, faced one of the most defining tests of Mongol rule. The Golden Horde was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. Internal conflicts and rival Khans weakened its grip, while new powers emerged on its borders. Dmitry saw an opportunity to challenge Mongol authority, not through open rebellion at first, but by building alliances among the Rus' princes and strengthening Moscow's army. The turning point came in the year 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, fought on the banks of the Don River. The Mongol general Mamai, who had ruled much of the Horde's western territories, faced Dmitry's coalition of Rus' forces. Chroniclers describe the moment as one of unity and faith. Before the battle, the monk Sergius of Radonej blessed Dmitry and his troops, sending 2 warrior monks to fight alongside them. The battle was fierce and bloody. Dmitry's army won a hard-fought victory, and the Mongol forces were driven from the field. The triumph at Kulikovo did not end Mongol domination. The Horde soon retaliated and reasserted its authority, but it changed the psychological landscape of Rus'. For the first time in generations, a Russian prince had defeated a Mongol army in open battle. The event became a symbol of hope, remembered as a moral victory that proved the Mongols could be resisted. Dmitry himself earned the title Donskoy, meaning of the dawn, in honor of his victory. In the century that followed, Moscow continued its steady rise while the Golden Horde fractured into smaller khanates. New principalities like Tver, Ryazan, and Novgorod remained competitors, but Moscow's combination of political skill, religious favor, and military power set it apart. The city became a magnet for settlers, merchants, and nobles seeking protection and opportunity. Through careful marriages, purchases of land, and limited warfare, Moscow absorbed smaller territories and expanded its domain. By the late 15th century, a new ruler would complete Moscow's transformation. Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, came to power in 1462. Under his leadership, the Grand Duchy of Moscow evolved into a centralized, independent state. Ivan expanded his territory dramatically, bringing most of the Rus' principalities under his control through conquest or diplomacy. He married Sofia Palaiologina, a niece of the last Byzantine emperor, linking Moscow to the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire. This marriage carried powerful symbolism. If Constantinople had fallen to the Ottomans in 1453, then Moscow, still orthodox and independent, could now claim to be its successor, the Third Rome. Ivan's reign marked the decisive end of Mongol authority in Russia. The final confrontation came in 1480 in an event known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River. The Khan of what remained of the Golden Horde demanded tribute from Ivan, who refused to pay. Both sides gathered their armies on opposite banks of the Ugra River, south of Moscow. For weeks, they faced each other without fighting. The Mongols, weakened by internal struggles and lacking supplies, eventually withdrew. No battle was fought, but the outcome was clear. Mongol rule over the Rus' lands was finished. With the departure of the Horde, Ivan the Great declared his sovereignty. He no longer referred to himself as a mere grand prince, but as the ruler of all Russia. He introduced new symbols of authority, including the double-headed eagle, borrowed from Byzantium, which would later become the emblem of the Russian Empire. Under his rule, Moscow began to take on the features of a true capital, fortified with new walls, adorned with stone cathedrals, and organized under a more centralized administration. Ivan's consolidation of power was not only military and political, but also legal. He issued new laws, strengthened the role of the central treasury, and imposed greater control over the boyars, the powerful land-owning nobles. His court became the center of governance, and his word carried the weight of law. By the time of his death in 1505, Moscow had become the unchallenged heart of a new Russian state. The legacy of the Mongol period did not disappear. Many of the practices that shaped Muscovite governance, such as the system of tribute collection, the organization of the army, and the emphasis on absolute loyalty to the ruler, owed their origins to the experience of Mongol rule. Yet Moscow transformed these lessons into something uniquely its own. The result was a centralized monarchy that combined Orthodox faith, Byzantine symbolism, and steppe-inspired authority. The Orthodox Church played a crucial role in legitimizing this transformation. Monks and chroniclers depicted the rise of Moscow as part of a divine plan. The idea of Moscow as the Third Rome spread in religious writings during the early 16th century, but its roots were already visible under Ivan the Great. The Church presented Moscow's rulers as defenders of true Christianity, destined to lead the Orthodox world after the fall of Constantinople. This belief gave the princes not only political power, but also spiritual purpose. At the same time, Moscow's expansion drew it into new conflicts. The independent Republic of Novgorod, proud of its traditions of trade and self-government, resisted Muscovite domination. In 1478, Ivan the Great launched a campaign to subdue it. After a brief struggle, Novgorod was defeated and annexed. Its leaders were exiled, and its famous Vech, the public assembly bell that symbolized its freedom, was taken to Moscow. The incorporation of Novgorod marked both the triumph of central authority and the end of the last independent Rus' republic. When Ivan IV was crowned as the first Tsar of all Rus in the year 1547, he inherited a state that had been forged in the fires of Mongol domination and tempered by the calculated rise of Moscow's princes. Yet under his rule, that state would transform into something unprecedented, a centralized autocracy with imperial ambitions. Ivan's reign marked the birth of the Russian Empire in all but name, combining ruthless consolidation of power with territorial expansion that extended Russia's reach far beyond its old medieval frontiers. But it was also an age of fear, repression, and contradiction, for the same ruler who built the empire's foundation also drenched it in blood. Ivan IV was born in 1530. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when Ivan was only 3 years old, leaving the throne to a child. The boy's mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as regent but died mysteriously just a few years later. In the power vacuum that followed, rival boyar families, the great landowning nobles, struggled for control of the court. Young Ivan grew up surrounded by intrigue, cruelty, and betrayal. Chroniclers later described how he witnessed violence even inside the Kremlin, shaping his deep mistrust of the aristocracy and his conviction that absolute authority was the only path to order. In 1547, at the age of 17, Ivan was crowned Tsar, a title derived from Caesar, signaling continuity with the legacy of Rome and Byzantium. The coronation ceremony was elaborate and symbolic. Ivan was anointed with holy oil by the Metropolitan, uniting sacred and temporal power. By taking this title, Ivan declared that Moscow was no longer merely a grand principality, it was an empire, and its ruler a divinely ordained sovereign whose authority came from God, not from any assembly of nobles. Early in his reign, Ivan showed remarkable energy and vision. He sought to modernize the government, strengthen the army, and centralize administration. In 1550, he convened the first Zemsky Sobor, a national assembly that included nobles, clergy, and townsmen. Though limited in power, it symbolized a new kind of consultation between ruler and realm. Around the same time, Ivan and his advisors introduced a new legal code, the Sudebnik of 1550, which standardized laws across the expanding territory and tightened control over local officials. Ivan's reforms extended to the military as well. He created a standing army known as the Streltsy, armed with firearms and organized under direct state control. This innovation gave Moscow a reliable force independent of the feudal levies supplied by boyars. He also reorganized the system of landholding through the Oprichnina, a policy that would later take on a far darker meaning. But Ivan's greatest early achievements came through conquest. For centuries, the Rus' lands had lived under the shadow of the Mongol successor states, the Khanates that ruled the Volga and steppe regions. Ivan set out to end their threat once and for all. In 1552, his forces captured Kazan, the capital of the Tatar Khanate that had long dominated the Middle Volga. The victory was celebrated as a holy triumph. Priests led processions, and the Cathedral of St. Basil was later built on Red Square to commemorate it. 4 years later, the conquest of Astrakhan brought the lower Volga under Moscow's control, cutting off the remnants of Mongol influence and opening routes toward the Caspian Sea. These victories transformed Russia into a true multi-ethnic empire. The annexed territories included not only Tatars, but also Finno-Ugric and Turkic peoples who were now subject to Moscow's rule. Ivan encouraged missionary work, but also allowed limited autonomy to local elites who pledged loyalty. The model of governance developed in these new lands, direct control from the center combined with tolerance of local customs, would become a hallmark of Russian imperial administration in later centuries. After his eastern successes, Ivan turned his attention westward. He sought access to the Baltic Sea, where trade with Western Europe could flourish. This ambition led to the Livonian War, launched in 1558 against the Livonian Order, a military state controlling modern-day Latvia and Estonia. At first, Russian armies achieved rapid victories, capturing several fortresses and threatening the Baltic coast. However, the war soon expanded as Sweden, Denmark, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth intervened. The conflict dragged on for more than 2 decades, draining Russia's finances and manpower. In the end, Moscow's gains were lost, and the dream of a Baltic port remained unfulfilled. The long and costly war deepened Ivan's suspicion that treachery within his own ranks was undermining him. His growing paranoia reached its height in the 1560s, when he launched one of the most infamous campaigns of repression in Russian history, the Oprichnina. Beginning in 1565, Ivan divided the country into 2 parts: the Oprichnina, his personal domain governed directly by him and his chosen men, and the Zemshchina, the rest of the realm under traditional administration. The Oprichniki, Ivan's black-clad enforcers, swore absolute loyalty to the Tsar and terrorized the population. They confiscated estates, executed suspected traitors, and massacred entire towns. Their symbol, a dog's head and a broom, represented their duty to sniff out and sweep away treason. The terror reached its brutal peak in 1570 when Ivan ordered the destruction of Novgorod, accusing its inhabitants of plotting to defect to Poland. Thousands were killed in days of slaughter, and the city's prosperity was shattered. The Oprichnina had devastating consequences. It broke the power of the boyars, but also destabilized the economy and depopulated vast regions. Villages were abandoned, trade declined, and the treasury emptied. By the time Ivan abolished the Oprichnina in 1572, Russia was weaker and more fearful than ever. Yet, the idea behind it, the ruler's right to absolute control over land and life, became a permanent feature of Russian autocracy. The later years of Ivan's reign were marked by personal tragedy and instability. His beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned. Her death deepened Ivan's paranoia and cruelty. In a fit of rage during an argument, Ivan struck and killed his own son and heir, also named Ivan. The horrific act left the Tsar without a capable successor and haunted his memory. Contemporary witnesses described the ruler's remorse, yet his temper and suspicion never faded. Despite his cruelty, Ivan was not a mere tyrant without vision. He promoted printing and literacy, establishing the first Russian printing press in Moscow. He corresponded with Western monarchs, including Queen Elizabeth of England, exploring the possibility of trade and even marriage alliances. He also encouraged exploration into Siberia, where Cossack adventurers like Yermak Timofeyevich began to push beyond the Ural Mountains. Though these expeditions were still small in scale, they marked the beginning of Russia's vast eastward expansion. Ivan's complex personality left historians divided. Some saw him as a reformer who sought to modernize Russia and defend it from foreign enemies. Others remembered him as a despot consumed by fear and bloodlust. In truth, he was both, a man who built a centralized, powerful state at immense human cost. By the time of his death in 1584, Russia was vastly larger than when he had inherited it, but it was also exhausted and unstable. When Ivan IV died in the year 1584, he left behind a kingdom that was larger than any previous Russian state, but deeply wounded by war, famine, and fear. The central authority he had built rested entirely on the force of his own will. Once he was gone, the system began to fracture. What followed was one of the darkest and most chaotic periods in Russian history. A generation of famine, civil war, and foreign intervention remembered as the time of troubles. It would test the very existence of the Russian state, but also lead to the birth of a new dynasty and a new sense of national unity. The immediate problem was succession. Ivan's surviving son, Fyodor I, took the throne, but he was weak in health and limited in intellect. The true power behind the throne rested with his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, a capable and ambitious nobleman. Boris had served as one of Ivan's key administrators, and under Fyodor, he became de facto ruler of the realm. For a few years, his leadership brought stability. He reorganized the government, promoted education, and encouraged foreign trade. Moscow's relations with Western Europe improved, and new embassies arrived from England and the Holy Roman Empire. But the stability was fragile. When Fyodor died in 1598 without an heir, the ancient Ryurikid dynasty came to an end after more than 7 centuries of rule. With no direct successor, Boris Godunov was elected Tsar by a national assembly, the Zemsky Sobor. His election marked the first time the Russian throne had passed by means of political consent rather than inheritance, a sign of both the kingdom's adaptability and its crisis. Boris's legitimacy, however, was widely doubted. Many boyars resented his rise from a lesser noble family. Rumors spread that he had murdered Ivan IV's youngest son, Dmitry, years earlier, to eliminate a rival claimant. Though Dmitry had died as a child in the town of Uglich, whispers of his survival would soon shake the realm. In the early years of Boris's reign, nature itself seemed to conspire against him. Between 1569 and 1603, a series of poor harvests struck the Russian heartland. Crops failed, livestock died, and entire villages starved. The famine of 1601 to 1603 was among the worst in Russian history. Contemporary accounts speak of corpses lining the roads, of people reduced to eating bark, grass, and even each other. As many as 1/3 of the population perished. The government attempted to import grain and distribute aid, but the scale of the disaster was beyond its capacity. Starvation bred resentment, and resentment turned into rebellion. It was in this atmosphere of suffering that a strange rumor began to circulate. That Dmitry, the supposedly dead son of Ivan IV, had somehow survived and was returning to claim his rightful throne. The man who appeared in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth around 1603 called himself Dmitry Ivanovich and gathered a following among discontented Russians, Polish nobles, and even Jesuit priests who hoped to bring Catholic influence into Russia. Known to history as the False Dmitry, he crossed the border with a small army in 1604. The rebellion spread quickly. Many peasants and Cossacks joined him, not necessarily out of loyalty, but out of desperation and hatred for Boris's regime. As the pretender advanced toward Moscow, Boris Godunov suddenly died, perhaps of natural causes, perhaps not. In 1605, his death removed the last real obstacle to the pretender's success. The false Dmitry entered Moscow in triumph and was crowned Tsar. At first, the new ruler tried to present himself as a reformer and a man of mercy. He issued pardons, reduced taxes, and invited foreign craftsmen to modernize the army. But his reliance on Polish advisors and his rumored intention to marry a Catholic woman fueled suspicion that he was an agent of foreign interests. The boyars who had supported him turned against him, and within a year a palace coup erupted. In 1606, Dmitry was dragged from the Kremlin and killed. His body was burned, and the ashes fired from a cannon in the direction of Poland. The chaos did not end with his death. In the years that followed, a series of new pretenders arose, each claiming to be the real Dmitry, who had somehow escaped assassination. At the same time, the throne passed to Vasily Shuisky, a cautious but unpopular boyar who ruled from 1606 to 1610. Shuisky lacked authority and faced revolts across the countryside. Bandit groups known as Razboyniki and Cossack warbands roamed freely, looting towns and villages. Meanwhile, Russia's weakness invited foreign intervention. Poland and Sweden, both ambitious regional powers, sought to exploit the disorder. Polish troops entered Russia under the pretext of supporting another false Dmitry, but their real aim was domination. In 1610, the Polish army occupied Moscow itself, and the boyars, desperate and divided, agreed to recognize the Polish Prince Władysław as Tsar. For the first time since its founding, the Russian capital was under foreign control. The occupation provoked widespread outrage. Across the country, local militias began to form, calling for the defense of orthodoxy and the expulsion of the invaders. Among the most famous leaders of this national movement were Kuzma Minin, a merchant from Nizhny Novgorod, and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, a minor noble and experienced soldier. Together, they organized a Second Volunteer Army in 1612 and marched toward Moscow. The siege that followed lasted months, but in the autumn, the Polish garrison surrendered. The liberation of Moscow was a moment of profound national pride. It was celebrated not as a mere military victory, but as the salvation of the Russian land and faith. Yet even after the capital was freed, the state remained without a ruler. The nobles and clergy gathered once again in the Zemsky Sobor to choose a new czar. They sought someone with legitimate blood ties to the old dynasty, yet also capable of uniting a fractured country. Their choice fell on 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov, the son of Patriarch Filaret, a respected church leader who had himself been imprisoned by the Poles. In 1613, Mikhail was elected Tsar, marking the end of the time of troubles and the beginning of a new dynasty that would rule Russia for more than 3 centuries. The election of Mikhail Romanov represented more than a change of rulers. It was a moment of restoration, of order, faith, and identity. The experience of chaos had reshaped how Russians understood their state. The idea of unity under a strong, divinely sanctioned ruler gained new force, and the bond between the throne and the Orthodox Church deepened. The people's role in choosing the Tsar, through the Zemsky Sobor, also became part of the national myth, though in reality such assemblies would soon fade as autocracy reasserted itself. Under Mikhail, Russia began to recover from its long nightmare. His reign focused on rebuilding rather than expansion. The devastated towns were repopulated, trade resumed, and new diplomatic ties were established. The boyars who had survived the troubles were tamed through compromise and co-optation. Slowly, the scars of war and famine began to heal. When Mikhail Romanov was crowned in the year 1613, he inherited not a powerful kingdom, but a land scarred by famine, invasion, and civil war. The Russia that emerged from the time of troubles was impoverished, depopulated, and exhausted. Its institutions had collapsed, its borders had shrunk, and its people were wary of both foreign enemies and internal rivals. Yet in the ruins of chaos, there was also opportunity, the chance to rebuild, to restore order, and to lay the foundations of a more enduring state. The early Romanovs would spend the 17th century doing exactly that, slowly reconstructing the machinery of government and expanding across the immense spaces of Eurasia, forging an empire that would one day stretch from the Baltic to the Pacific. Mikhail Romanov was only 16 years old when he ascended the throne, chosen less for his experience than for his lineage and his neutrality. He was connected by blood to the old Ryurikid dynasty through his mother and represented a compromise among rival boyar factions. His father, Filaret Romanov, had been taken captive during the Polish occupation, but later returned to Russia and became Patriarch of the Orthodox Church. Together, father and son ruled as partners in a delicate balance between secular and religious authority. The first task of the new dynasty was survival. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth still held Russian territory in the west, while Sweden occupied the northern lands near Novgorod. Mikhail's government sought peace at any cost. In 1617, Russia signed the Truce of Dulino with Poland, ceding Smolensk and other border regions but ending open warfare. 2 years later, peace with Sweden secured the northwestern frontier. These treaties were humiliating but necessary. They bought the time needed to rebuild. The reconstruction of the state began with restoring basic order. The government reorganized taxation, re-established provincial administration, and reasserted the authority of the central bureaucracy. A network of prikazy, or government offices, handled everything from foreign affairs to the military and justice. Many of these institutions had existed under the late medieval czars, but now they were expanded and systematized. The bureaucracy became the backbone of the new Romanov regime, staffed by service nobles whose loyalty depended on state favor rather than ancient lineage. Socially, the most consequential development of the 17th century was the final binding of the peasantry to the land. Serfdom, which had existed in partial forms for centuries, became formalized under Mikhail's successors. The constant wars and population losses of the time of troubles had led many peasants to flee their estates, seeking refuge in the forest frontier or among the semi-independent Cossacks. To stabilize the economy, the government issued decrees restricting movement and requiring peasants to remain under their landlord's authority. This culminated in the Sobornoye Ulozhenie, the law code of 1649 promulgated under Tsar Alexei, Mikhail's son. It declared that runaway peasants could be pursued and reclaimed indefinitely, effectively making serfdom hereditary and permanent. The Sobornoye Ulozhenie was more than a labor law. It was a comprehensive legal code that defined the relationship between ruler and subject, noble and serf, church and state. It standardized punishments, clarified property rights, and reinforced the Tsar's position as the supreme source of authority. In many ways, it marked the completion of the centralizing project begun under Ivan IV, but with less terror and more bureaucracy. The state was becoming stronger, more organized, and increasingly absolute. While the government consolidated power at home, it also began to look outward once more. To the east lay the vast, sparsely populated lands of Siberia, a frontier that stretched beyond imagination. Russian expansion into Siberia had begun tentatively during Ivan IV's reign with the campaigns of Yermak Timofeyevich, a Cossack leader who defeated the Khanate of Sibir in the 1500s. But under the early Romanovs, this movement became systematic. Cossacks, fur traders, and adventurers crossed the Ural Mountains, founding forts and trading posts along the great Siberian rivers, the Ob, the Yenisei, and eventually the Lena. These expeditions were often privately financed by merchant families or local governors but sanctioned by the state. In return for furs, the Siberian peoples, Yakuts, Evenks, and others, were required to pay tribute in the form of pelts, known as yasak. The fur trade became one of Russia's most valuable economic assets, financing the treasury and linking the empire to markets as far away as China and Western Europe. By the mid-17th century, Russian explorers had reached the Pacific Ocean. In 1639, a group of Cossacks established a fort on the Sea of Okhotsk, effectively completing the crossing of Eurasia. The sheer scale of this expansion was extraordinary. In the span of little more than a century, Russia had grown from a landlocked kingdom into a transcontinental empire. Its new frontier stretched thousands of miles eastward, encompassing an enormous diversity of climates, landscapes, and peoples. This eastward movement was not purely imperial conquest. It also reflected deeper social pressures. The rigid structure of serfdom in European Russia pushed many peasants, outlaws, and Cossacks to flee to the frontier in search of freedom. Siberia became a land of exile and opportunity, a place where the authority of the state was distant yet always expanding. The frontier dynamic would shape Russian identity for centuries to come, blending coercion with exploration, exile with discovery. Back in the heartland, the Romanov state continued to evolve. Tsar Alexei, who reigned from 1645 to 1676, presided over a period of both growth and turmoil. He was deeply religious and saw himself as a guardian of orthodoxy. Under his rule, the Church underwent one of the most dramatic crises in its history, the Schism of the Old Believers. The controversy began when Patriarch Nikon, a powerful and ambitious cleric, sought to reform church rituals and texts to bring them into closer alignment with the Greek Orthodox tradition. Many Russians, however, viewed these changes as heresy. They believed that the old practices were sacred and that altering them would bring divine punishment. When Nikon imposed his reforms with the Tsar's support, resistance erupted across the country. The dissenters, known as Old Believers, were persecuted, exiled, and executed. Some burned themselves alive in acts of defiance. The schism split Russian Orthodoxy into warring factions, and the wounds would last for generations. Yet it also strengthened the Tsar's control over the Church. After Nikon fell from favor, the Patriarchate became increasingly subordinate to the state, a pattern that would continue into the imperial period. The fusion of autocracy and orthodoxy was now complete. The Tsar was both ruler and defender of the faith, and the Church was an arm of the monarchy. Alexei's reign also witnessed renewed military conflicts. In 1654, Russia became involved in a long struggle with Poland over the lands of Ukraine. The Cossacks of the Dnieper region, led by Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky, sought protection from Polish domination and pledged allegiance to the Tsar. This alliance drew Russia into a series of wars with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and later with Sweden. The conflicts were costly but successful. By the Treaty of Andrusovo in 1667, Russia gained control of left-bank Ukraine, including the city of Kyiv. These wars marked a significant shift in Russia's position in Eastern Europe. For the first time since the fall of Kyiv centuries earlier, Moscow reasserted its presence on the Dnieper and in the old lands of Kievan Rus. The symbolic importance of regaining Kyiv was immense. It connected the Romanov state to the origins of Russian Christianity and to the memory of a united Rus. When Peter the Great came to power at the close of the 17th century, Russia was still a largely medieval society, vast, agrarian, and inward-looking. The Romanovs had restored order after the chaos of the time of troubles and had expanded the empire's borders across Eurasia, yet Russia remained isolated from the intellectual and technological transformations reshaping Western Europe. Peter would change that. Through relentless reform, ruthless determination, and war on a continental scale, he dragged Russia into the modern era. Under his rule, the Muscovite state became the Russian Empire, and its ruler took his place among the crowned heads of Europe. Peter was born in the year 1672, the son of Tsar Alexei and his second wife, Natalia Naryshkina. When Alexei died, the throne passed to Peter's half-brother, Fyodor III, and then to another half-brother, Ivan V, who ruled jointly with Peter under the regency of their formidable sister, Sophia. During his childhood, Peter witnessed both the violence and intrigue of Moscow's court politics. In 1682, when he was only 10 years old, the elite Streltsy regiments mutinied, killing members of his family and plunging the capital into bloodshed. The young prince was forced to hide from the rebels and grew up deeply mistrustful of the old aristocracy and the traditional order they represented. When he came of age, Peter overthrew Sophia's regency and assumed full control, though he continued to share the throne nominally with his ailing brother, Ivan. From the beginning, Peter was unlike any Russian ruler before him. He was unusually tall, over 2 meters by modern reckoning, and possessed immense physical energy. His curiosity knew no bounds. He studied shipbuilding, artillery, anatomy, and navigation. He practiced crafts with his own hands, building boats, forging iron, and dissecting corpses to learn medicine. For Peter, knowledge was power, and modern technology was the key to transforming Russia. Peter's first taste of modern Europe came in 1697, when he undertook the so-called Grand Embassy, a diplomatic mission through Western Europe disguised partly as a learning expedition. Traveling incognito under the name Sergeant Pyotr Mikhailov, he visited the Dutch Republic, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. He studied shipyards in Amsterdam, observed parliaments in London, and met scientists and military engineers. The journey opened his eyes to the technological sophistication of the West and to the backwardness of his own country. Upon returning to Russia, Peter embarked on a program of reform unmatched in scale and ambition. His goal was to modernize every aspect of Russian life, military, administrative, social, and cultural, and to turn his state into a European power capable of competing with its neighbors. The first step was the army. Peter understood that Russia could not defend its immense frontiers or expand its influence without a modern military. He reorganized the armed forces along European lines, replacing the outdated feudal levies with a standing army of conscripts drawn from all classes. Foreign officers were recruited to train Russian soldiers, and new weapons and uniforms were introduced. The Navy, long neglected, became Peter's obsession. He founded shipyards along the White Sea and later on the Baltic, ordering the construction of a fleet from scratch. "A ruler without a navy," he once said, "is a man without eyes." To support these military ambitions, Peter needed money, industry, and skilled labor. He overhauled the taxation system, imposing new levies on households, goods, and even beards. He encouraged the establishment of ironworks, foundries, and textile factories. Skilled craftsmen from Europe were invited to Russia with generous incentives, while young Russians were sent abroad to learn trades and sciences. Slowly, a new professional and technical class began to emerge, loyal not to old aristocratic traditions but to the state. Peter's reforms extended into the heart of governance. The old prikazi system of government offices was replaced by specialized colleges or departments modeled on Swedish and Dutch examples. A senate was created to supervise administration in the Tsar's absence, while new provincial divisions replaced the outdated local hierarchies. The bureaucracy grew rapidly, staffed by officials whose service to the state determined their rank and privilege. This principle was later codified in the Table of Ranks, introduced in 1722, which made government or military service the path to status, undermining the hereditary privileges of the boyars. One of Peter's most radical acts was to reshape the cultural appearance and habits of his people. He viewed the long beards, traditional robes, and customs of old Muscovite as symbols of backwardness. In a decree that shocked conservative society, he ordered the nobility to shave their beards and adopt Western clothing. Those who refused were taxed or fined. He introduced the Western calendar, modernized the alphabet, and founded schools for mathematics, navigation, and engineering. Even social etiquette changed. Peter introduced mixed gatherings where men and women could converse freely, a novelty in traditional Russian society. While these reforms provoked resistance among the conservative classes, Peter enforced them with characteristic ruthlessness. The church, long a pillar of the old order, was brought firmly under state control. After the death of Patriarch Adrian, Peter refused to appoint a successor and instead created the Holy Synod, a government body that managed church affairs under his supervision. In effect, the Russian Orthodox Church became an instrument of the state, its spiritual authority subordinated to the needs of empire. Peter's internal reforms were matched by his external ambitions. His central goal was to secure access to warm water ports and open Russia to global trade. To achieve this, he waged 2 major wars that would define his reign. The first was against the Ottoman Empire, aimed at gaining a foothold on the Black Sea. In 1696, Peter launched a campaign to capture the fortress of Azov, which guarded the mouth of the Don River. After an initial failure, he returned with a new navy and captured the city in 1697, gaining a symbolic victory and the beginnings of a southern fleet. But Peter's greatest test came in the north against Sweden, then one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. The Great Northern War began in 1700 when Russia joined a coalition with Denmark and Saxony-Poland against Sweden's young king, Charles XII. The early stages were disastrous for Russia. In 1700, Charles crushed Peter's army at Narva, exposing the weaknesses of his newly formed forces. Yet Peter refused to surrender. He reorganized the army, built new fortifications, and trained his troops with renewed discipline. During this long conflict, Peter made one of his most enduring decisions: the founding of a new capital. In 1703, he began construction of St. Petersburg on the marshy delta of the Neva River, territory newly taken from Sweden. The site was harsh and unhealthy, but Peter saw it as a window to the west. Thousands of laborers, many of them conscripted peasants, worked in brutal conditions to build the city's canals, fortresses, and palaces. By 1712, the court and government had moved there from Moscow. St. Petersburg became the symbol of Peter's reforms, modern, maritime, and European in spirit. The turning point of the Great Northern War came in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava in Ukraine. Peter's reorganized army decisively defeated the Swedes, ending their dominance in the Baltic and transforming Russia into a great European power. The victory was celebrated across the continent. When the war finally ended in 1721 with the Treaty of Nystad, Russia gained vast territories along the Baltic coast: Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and parts of Karelia. These lands gave Russia its long-sought access to the sea and established it as the dominant power in Northern Europe. The final years of Peter's reign were devoted to consolidating his achievements. He reformed succession laws to allow the Tsar to choose his heir, though this decision would later cause chaos. He reorganized the navy and launched expeditions to explore the Caspian Sea and the Arctic. In 1721, he formally adopted the title Emperor of all Russia, transforming the Tsardom into the Russian Empire. The change of title reflected a new identity. Russia was no longer a medieval kingdom, but a European empire with global ambitions. When Peter the Great died in the year 1725, he left behind a colossal empire, a new capital, and a powerful administrative system. But no clear successor. His sweeping reforms had modernized Russia's military, economy, and bureaucracy, yet they had also unsettled the traditional order and created new sources of instability. The question of succession, which Peter himself had attempted to control by decree, proved the most dangerous of all. In the decades that followed his death, Russia entered a period of political turbulence marked by palace coups, shifting alliances, and competing factions. Yet, through all the intrigue and bloodshed, the imperial machine Peter had built kept running. The empire continued to grow, its institutions endured, and the idea of autocracy remained firmly intact. Peter's death left the throne vacant because he had not named an heir. His only surviving child, his daughter Elizabeth, was still young, and his chosen heir, his son Alexei, had died under mysterious and tragic circumstances. Into this uncertainty stepped Peter's widow, Catherine I. A woman of humble origins, born Martha Skavronska to a peasant family, Catherine had risen from obscurity to become Peter's consort and confidant. She had accompanied him on military campaigns, shared his hardships, and was deeply trusted by him. Though she lacked education and political training, she was supported by the powerful Guards regiments and Peter's loyal advisor, Alexander Menshikov. Catherine's short reign, lasting only 2 years, represented the first of many palace compromises that would define the era. With Menshikov's help, she maintained stability and continued Peter's policies. She confirmed the rights of the new nobility, funded the army and navy, and upheld the bureaucracy's structure. Her reign also saw the creation of the Supreme Privy Council, a body of high-ranking nobles meant to assist in governance, a sign that the elite were reasserting influence after years of Peter's personal rule. But Catherine's health was failing, and when she died in 1727, power once again shifted through intrigue rather than law. Menshikov, ever the strategist, arranged for Peter's grandson, the young Peter II, to be crowned Tsar. The boy was only 12 years old, and Menshikov intended to rule through him as regent. However, his arrogance and corruption alienated other nobles, and within months he was overthrown and exiled. Peter II's reign was brief and largely controlled by rival aristocratic factions, particularly the powerful Dolgoruki family. The young Tsar, however, died unexpectedly of smallpox in 1730, ending the direct male line of Peter the Great. The throne then passed to Anna Ivanovna, daughter of Peter's half-brother Ivan V. The Supreme Privy Council hoped to use her as a puppet and imposed on her a set of conditions that would have limited her power and established a form of constitutional monarchy. Anna, however, had other plans. Upon arriving in St. Petersburg, she dramatically tore up the conditions before the assembled nobles, declaring that she would rule as her uncle Peter had done, with absolute authority. Anna's reign, from 1730 to 1740, marked the restoration of autocratic rule, though under a very different personality. She was not a reformer or a visionary, but a cautious and conservative ruler. Her court was heavily influenced by German advisors, most notably Ernst Johann Biron, whose dominance created resentment among Russian nobles. Under Anna, the empire continued to expand in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and the army remained strong. Yet her rule was remembered less for great achievements than for the harshness and extravagance of court life. The empire was stable, but the sense of purpose that had animated Peter's reforms was gone. When Anna died in 1740, she named her infant grandnephew, Ivan VI, as her successor, with Biron as regent. This arrangement quickly collapsed. The regent was despised, and rival factions within the Guards regiments saw an opportunity. In a swift coup led by Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great, Biron was overthrown, the infant Tsar deposed, and Elizabeth proclaimed Empress in 1741. Elizabeth's accession marked a turning point in the century of coups. She was popular with both the military and the people, in part because she was the direct daughter of Peter the Great and could claim his legacy. She promised to rule in his spirit, defending orthodoxy, autocracy, and the glory of Russia. Her reign would last for 2 decades, bringing relative stability and a revival of cultural and political confidence. Elizabeth was known for her charm and generosity, but also for her extravagance. She abolished the death penalty, a remarkable act for the era, and ruled without executing a single political prisoner. Yet her lavish spending on palaces, gowns, and court festivities was legendary. Under her patronage, the arts and architecture flourished, most notably through the work of the Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli, who designed the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg and the Smolny Convent. Politically, Elizabeth continued Peter's policy of Western engagement, particularly in education and science. She founded the University of Moscow in 1755 and the Academy of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg, laying the groundwork for Russia's intellectual awakening. The Empress also maintained a keen sense of Russia's growing role in European politics. During her reign, Russia participated decisively in the War of the Austrian Succession, and later in the 7 Years' War, one of the largest conflicts of the 18th century. In the 7 Years' War, Russia fought alongside Austria and France against Prussia and Britain. Russian armies under the capable generals Stepan Apraksin and Pyotr Rumyantsev won significant victories, even occupying Berlin at one point. Frederick the Great of Prussia, one of Europe's greatest military commanders, faced near defeat until Elizabeth's death in 1762 changed the balance of power. Her successor, Peter III, her nephew and grandson of Peter the Great's elder daughter, was an admirer of Frederick and immediately ended the war, returning all conquered territories. This act, known as the Miracle of the House of Brandenburg, saved Prussia, but enraged the Russian military and nobility, who saw it as a betrayal of their sacrifices. Peter III's brief reign, lasting only a few months, was one of the most curious in Russian history. Raised in the German Duchy of Holstein, he spoke poor Russian, neglected Orthodox customs, and openly admired Prussia's militarism. Despite some progressive intentions, such as limiting the power of the nobility over serfs and promoting religious tolerance, his erratic behavior and disdain for Russian traditions alienated nearly everyone around him. The final blow came when he offended the Guards regiments, the same elite soldiers who had made and unmade rulers for decades. In the summer of 1762, a coup d'état erupted in St. Petersburg. The leader of the conspiracy was none other than Peter's wife, the ambitious and intelligent Catherine, a German-born princess who had long studied Russian politics and language. Supported by the Guards and key nobles, she seized power and forced her husband to abdicate. Days later, Peter died under mysterious circumstances, officially from natural causes, though most suspected assassination. With Catherine's accession as Catherine II, later known as Catherine the Great, the long series of palace coups finally reached its culmination. The empire had endured nearly 4 decades of instability, passing from ruler to ruler through violence, intrigue, and military intervention. Yet through all of this, the structure of the state survived. The bureaucracy, the army, and the church, institutions forged under Peter the Great, remained functional and loyal to the throne, whoever occupied it. The palace coups revealed a fundamental paradox of 18th century Russia. While the succession to the throne was uncertain and often bloody, the empire itself had become resilient. The machinery of autocracy was strong enough to outlast the weaknesses of individual rulers. Even when politics descended into intrigue, the administration collected taxes, the army guarded borders, and the empire expanded. The continuity of the Russian state was not the result of stable leadership, but of a system designed to survive instability. When Catherine II seized the throne in the summer of 1762, few could have predicted that she would reign for more than 3 decades and transform Russia into one of the most powerful and culturally vibrant empires in Europe. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, Catherine had arrived in Russia as a teenage bride chosen for dynastic reasons. By the time she overthrew her husband, Peter III, she had become fluent in Russian, converted to Orthodoxy, and mastered the complex art of Russian court politics. Her ascent marked not only a political triumph but also the beginning of a new era, an age of imperial expansion, cultural flourishing, and intellectual engagement, balanced by the harsh realities of serfdom and rebellion. Catherine's first challenge was legitimacy. As a foreign-born usurper, she had to prove that she was more Russian than her husband had ever been, and that she could govern as effectively as her great predecessor, Peter the Great. To secure the throne, she relied on the support of the military, especially the powerful Guards regiments that had carried out the coup, and on the loyalty of key nobles. From the beginning, Catherine positioned herself as both a reformer in the spirit of the Enlightenment and a pragmatic ruler who understood the realities of Russian power. One of her earliest acts was to issue a manifesto affirming her commitment to good governance, justice, and the welfare of her subjects. She promised to rule according to reason and law, echoing the language of European philosophers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu, whose works she had studied and admired. Indeed, Catherine corresponded with Voltaire for years, discussing politics, philosophy, and the challenges of ruling a vast and diverse empire. But unlike the salon philosophers of Paris, Catherine ruled an autocracy where millions of peasants were bound to the land as serfs. Her challenge was to reconcile Enlightenment ideals with the practical demands of maintaining absolute authority. In 1767, she convened the Legislative Commission, an ambitious attempt to codify Russian law and rationalize administration. She invited representatives from all social estates, nobles, townsmen, and even some peasants, to discuss reforms. To guide the commission, Catherine prepared her famous nakaz, or instruction, a lengthy treatise drawing on the ideas of Montesquieu, Beccaria, and other Enlightenment thinkers. The nakaz called for equality before the law, humane punishments, and a rational government guided by reason rather than tradition. It rejected torture and arbitrary rule, proclaiming that Russia is a European state. Yet the realities of Russian society soon limited Catherine's ambitions. The commission, though intellectually impressive, achieved little in practice. The deep divisions between social classes, the vested interests of the nobility, and the vastness of the empire made comprehensive reform impossible. After 2 years, the Legislative Commission was dissolved, and Catherine turned her attention to more immediate and tangible forms of state building. Under Catherine's reign, the Russian bureaucracy expanded and became more professional. She reorganized provincial administration, dividing the empire into new territories with appointed governors, courts, and fiscal offices. Education also received new attention. She established the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-funded school for girls in Russia, and encouraged the founding of provincial schools. Printing houses multiplied, and the spread of literacy among the urban population increased slowly but noticeably. Catherine's vision of enlightened rule also extended to religion and culture. She tolerated other faiths, granting certain freedoms to Catholics, Muslims, and Protestants, and welcomed foreigners to settle and develop Russia's frontier regions. She encouraged Western art and architecture, filling St. Petersburg with neoclassical buildings and inviting artists, scientists, and educators from abroad. The Hermitage Museum, which began as her private collection of paintings, became one of the great cultural institutions of Europe. But while Catherine presented herself as a philosopher queen, her reign was also defined by relentless territorial expansion. She pursued the imperial mission with as much vigor as any of her predecessors, extending Russian power in every direction. In the south, she confronted the Ottoman Empire in a series of wars that opened the Black Sea to Russian control. The first conflict, from 1768 to 1774, ended with the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, a major diplomatic triumph. Russia gained access to the northern Black Sea coast, the right to protect Orthodox Christians in Ottoman territories, and the Crimean Khanate was declared independent, though in practice it soon became a Russian protectorate. In the west, Catherine turned her attention to Poland, a once powerful kingdom weakened by internal division and foreign interference. Over the course of 3 successive partitions, in 1772, 1793, and 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria carved up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, erasing it from the map of Europe. By the end of these partitions, Russia had annexed vast territories, including much of modern-day Belarus, Lithuania, and Ukraine. These acquisitions dramatically increased the empire's size and population, bringing millions of new subjects of different languages, religions, and cultures under Russian rule. The annexation of Crimea in 1783 completed Russia's southern expansion and fulfilled a long-standing strategic dream. The Crimean Peninsula provided warm water ports and access to the Mediterranean via the Black Sea, transforming Russia into a true maritime power. The new city of Sevastopol became the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. The conquest also carried symbolic meaning. It was presented as the liberation of Orthodox Christians from Muslim rule, reinforcing Russia's image as the defender of Eastern Christendom. However, the very process of expansion and reform deepened internal contradictions. The nobility, whose support Catherine needed to maintain her throne, demanded greater privileges. In 1785, she issued the charter to the nobility, confirming their exemption from taxes and compulsory service and granting them rights to land and serfs. This cemented the loyalty of the upper class but also entrenched the system of serfdom more deeply than ever before. As the nobility prospered, the peasants faced heavier burdens, higher rents, military recruitment, and harsh labor conditions. The growing discontent of the peasantry exploded in 1773 in one of the largest uprisings in Russian history, the Pugachev Rebellion. Led by Emelyan Pugachev, a Don Cossack who claimed to be the deceased Emperor Peter III, the revolt spread across the Volga region and the southern frontier. Peasants, Cossacks and non-Russian tribes joined the rebellion, attacking landlords, burning estates, and proclaiming freedom from serfdom. For nearly 2 years, vast areas of the empire were engulfed in chaos. Catherine's government responded with brutal force. Regular troops, commanded by experienced generals, eventually crushed the rebellion in 1775. Pugachev was captured and executed in Moscow, his body displayed as a warning. The rebellion horrified the nobility and convinced Catherine that radical reform of serfdom was impossible. From that point on, her policies grew more conservative. She tightened control over the provinces, increased censorship, and relied more heavily on the secret police to maintain order. Despite these tensions, Catherine's reign remained one of achievement and confidence. The empire's frontiers had expanded dramatically. Its population had grown to nearly twice its previous size, and its influence in European politics was unquestioned. At home, the arts flourished. Russian writers such as Denis von Wiesen and playwrights like Alexander Sumarokov helped create a distinct literary tradition, while architecture and painting reached new heights. St. Petersburg became one of Europe's great capitals, a symbol of Russian grandeur and sophistication. Catherine's final years were marked by both triumph and tragedy. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, horrified her and many other monarchs. Once an admirer of Enlightenment ideas, she now saw them as a threat to order and stability. She censored revolutionary writings, arrested suspected sympathizers, and abandoned her earlier reformist rhetoric. At the same time, she continued to expand Russia's influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia, preparing the way for future conquests. By the time of her death in 1796, Catherine the Great had reigned longer than any other Russian monarch except for her successor's successor, and she had transformed Russia into one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world. Under her rule, the empire's borders reached the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Dniester River. Russia had become a decisive actor in European affairs, a guardian of monarchic order, and a center of culture that rivaled Paris or Vienna. When Catherine the Great died in the autumn of 1796, she left behind a vast and confident empire, wealthy, expanding, and admired abroad. Yet within Russia, questions lingered about succession, governance, and the moral cost of power. Her son, Paul I, ascended the throne determined to reverse much of his mother's legacy and to assert the authority of the crown over the nobility that had flourished under her. His reign would be short and turbulent, paving the way for one of Russia's most complex and consequential rulers, Alexander I, who would face the titanic struggle against Napoleon and guide Europe into a new political order at the Congress of Vienna. Paul I was a man of contradictions. Well-intentioned but erratic, intelligent but deeply suspicious. Having grown up under Catherine's shadow and largely excluded from politics, he resented her and her circle of nobles. Almost immediately upon taking the throne, Paul sought to impose discipline on the aristocracy and restore what he saw as the dignity of the monarchy. He curtailed the privileges of the nobility granted by his mother, enforced strict military codes of conduct, and centralized authority. His reforms extended even to succession. In 1797, he issued the Pauline Laws, which established clear hereditary succession through the male line to prevent future palace coups. Despite his administrative energy, Paul alienated nearly every influential group in the empire. His obsession with military drill and his arbitrary decrees angered officers. His attempts to limit noble freedoms infuriated the elite, and his unpredictable foreign policy bewildered diplomats. Initially hostile to revolutionary France, he later reversed course and formed an alliance with Napoleon, dreaming of a joint campaign to conquer British India. This sudden shift alarmed both his generals and his court. In March of 1801, a group of conspirators, many of them high-ranking nobles and officers, stormed his palace in St. Petersburg. Paul was killed in the ensuing struggle, and his son Alexander, who may have known of the plot in advance, was proclaimed Tsar. The new ruler, Alexander I, was only in his mid-20s, tall, handsome, and well-educated. He had been tutored by the Swiss Republican philosopher Frédéric César de la Harpe, who instilled in him Enlightenment ideals of liberty and justice. Yet Alexander was also shaped by the autocratic traditions of his family and the trauma of his father's death. These conflicting influences would define his reign. He aspired to govern as a benevolent reformer, but remained cautious and often indecisive. In the early years of his rule, Alexander surrounded himself with young, reform-minded advisors, men like Mikhail Speransky and Count Novosiltsev, who sought to modernize the empire's administration. They proposed constitutional limits on autocracy, a reorganization of the ministries, and an independent judiciary. Some of these ideas were implemented, such as the creation of ministries to replace older bureaucratic colleges, but most were stalled by resistance from the nobility and the immense inertia of the imperial system. Even as Alexander spoke of enlightenment and progress, Russia's social structure remained unchanged. The majority of the population were still serfs bound to their landlords. Abroad, however, the young Tsar's reign was quickly dominated by the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise to power. Alexander saw himself as the defender of Europe's monarchies against the revolutionary tide emanating from France. Between 1805 and 1807, Russia joined a series of coalitions with Austria, Prussia, and Britain to resist Napoleon's expanding empire. The campaigns were marked by both bravery and disaster. In the autumn of 1805, Alexander personally led his troops in the campaign that culminated in the Battle of Austerlitz, fought in Moravia. It was one of Napoleon's greatest victories. The combined Russian and Austrian armies were decisively defeated, and the Russian forces were forced to retreat. 2 years later, in 1807, Russia suffered another crushing blow at the Battle of Friedland, where Napoleon's tactics annihilated much of Alexander's army. These defeats forced the Tsar into an uneasy peace. In the summer of 1807, he met Napoleon on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River near the town of Tilsit. The meeting was cordial and theatrical, as the two emperors, one the revolutionary conqueror, the other the idealistic monarch, sized each other up. The Treaty of Tilsit that followed marked the high point of Napoleon's power. Russia was compelled to join the continental system, Napoleon's blockade against British trade, and to recognize France's dominance in Europe. Though Alexander accepted the treaty publicly, in private he regarded it as a humiliation. For a few years, relations between the two empires remained outwardly friendly but inwardly tense. Russia's economy suffered under the trade restrictions of the continental system, and resentment toward France grew among the nobility and the army. At the same time, Napoleon's invasion of Spain and his annexation of German and Polish territories alarmed Alexander, who feared French influence encroaching on Russia's western borders. The alliance unraveled. By the spring of 1812, the fragile peace collapsed entirely. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 500,000 men drawn from across his empire, and invaded Russia. The campaign that followed became one of the most dramatic and catastrophic in world history. As the French crossed the Niemen River, Alexander refused to engage in direct negotiation. The Russian army, commanded by Generals Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, adopted a strategy of retreat, avoiding decisive battle while drawing the enemy deeper into the vast Russian interior. Villages were abandoned and crops burned in a scorched earth policy designed to deprive the invaders of supplies. The summer heat turned to autumn rain, and the French army began to suffer from exhaustion and hunger even before it reached Moscow. The only major engagement came in early September at the Battle of Borodino, west of Moscow. It was one of the bloodiest single days of combat in European history. Both sides claimed victory, but neither achieved a decisive result. The Russians withdrew in good order, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon entered the ancient capital to find it nearly deserted, and then, mysteriously, set ablaze by fires that destroyed most of the city. The French emperor waited in vain for Alexander to sue for peace. The Tsar, from his headquarters in the north, declared that he would never negotiate while a single enemy soldier remained on Russian soil. As the harsh Russian winter set in, Napoleon was forced to retreat. The march back from Moscow turned into a nightmare of starvation, frostbite, and constant harassment by Russian cavalry. Of the vast Grand Army that had entered Russia, only a fraction survived the journey home. The invasion ended in utter ruin for Napoleon and transformed the war into a crusade of liberation. In 1813, Russian troops pushed westward, pursuing the retreating French across Poland and into Germany. The following year, Alexander joined his allies, Prussia, Austria, and Britain, in a final campaign that culminated in Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Leipzig, the so-called Battle of Nations. By the spring of 1814, Russian soldiers marched triumphantly into Paris. The sight of Cossacks riding through the French capital astonished Europe and symbolized Russia's emergence as a continental superpower. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Alexander played a central role in reshaping post-Napoleonic Europe. He saw himself as both conqueror and peacemaker, guided by a belief in divine providence and moral duty. The settlement restored monarchies and sought to preserve balance among the great powers. Poland was reconstituted as a Kingdom of Poland under Alexander's rule, giving Russia direct influence deep into Central Europe. The Tsar also promoted the creation of the Holy Alliance, a coalition of Christian monarchs, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, committed to upholding religion, peace, and legitimacy. For Russia, victory over Napoleon brought immense prestige and influence, but also new challenges. The empire now stretched farther west than ever before, incorporating millions of new subjects, including Poles, Lithuanians, and Finns. Yet at home, the ideals of liberty and nationalism that had spread through Europe found an uneasy echo among Russian officers who had fought across the continent. They had seen societies less burdened by autocracy and serfdom and returned with questions about Russia's future. Alexander himself emerged from the war a changed man. The triumphs that should have crowned his reign instead deepened his spiritual doubts. Haunted by his father's death and the suffering of war, he turned increasingly toward mysticism and religious contemplation. His later years were marked by indecision, as early reformist energy gave way to conservatism. The Tsar, who had once dreamed of a constitution, now ruled through censorship and police surveillance. When Alexander I died unexpectedly in the winter of 1825, he left behind a victorious but restless empire. Russia had emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as one of the great powers of Europe, yet beneath the triumph lay unresolved contradictions, a society ruled by autocracy, sustained by serfdom, and increasingly aware of its distance from the liberal ideas spreading across the continent. The confusion following the Tsar's death would expose these tensions and set the tone for the reign of his successor, Nicholas I, a ruler who embodied discipline, hierarchy, and control. The succession crisis began because Alexander had no surviving legitimate sons. According to the law of succession established by Paul I, the throne should have passed to his next brother, Constantine, the governor of Poland. But Constantine had secretly renounced his claim years earlier, preferring his Polish command and a morganatic marriage that disqualified him from the line of succession. Few knew of his decision, and when Alexander's death became public, the empire swore allegiance first to Constantine, then, after he refused, to Nicholas, the younger brother. The confusion created a brief power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a small but determined group of reform-minded officers. These men, known to history as the Decemberists, were veterans of the Napoleonic campaigns. They had seen the parliamentary systems and civic freedoms of Western Europe and believed that Russia, too, must evolve beyond autocracy. On a cold December morning in St. Petersburg, they gathered with several thousand soldiers in Senate Square, refusing to swear loyalty to Nicholas and demanding a constitution. It was the first organized political uprising in Russian history. Nicholas, who had barely been crowned, faced a choice that would define his reign. He chose suppression. Loyal troops surrounded the rebels, and after hours of tense standoff, the square was cleared by cannon fire. The rebellion was crushed. Its leaders were executed or sent to Siberia. This violent beginning left a deep impression on the new Tsar. To Nicholas I, the Decemberist Revolt was not merely treason, but a symptom of moral decay, a warning of what could happen when order and obedience were weakened by foreign ideas. From that moment, he conceived his mission as one of preservation, to defend autocracy, orthodoxy, and national identity against revolution, liberalism, and the uncertainties of modern change. His reign would become synonymous with control, political, intellectual, and spiritual. Nicholas was not without personal virtues. He was disciplined, punctual, and genuinely devoted to duty. Rising early each morning, he reviewed reports, signed decrees, and maintained constant contact with his ministers. His presence radiated authority. Contemporaries described him as tall, imposing, and impeccably dressed in military uniform. Yet beneath his rigid self-control lay insecurity. Haunted by the memory of the Decembrists and fearful of internal dissent, he built a system of governance designed to monitor every aspect of life within the empire. The central pillar of Nicholas's rule was the triad of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. This ideological formula, articulated by his education minister Count Sergei Uvarov, was meant to define what it meant to be Russian. Orthodoxy affirmed the special role of the Russian Orthodox Church as guardian of moral truth. Autocracy declared the Tsar's authority as absolute and divinely ordained, and nationality called for loyalty to the Russian state and people, distinct from the subversive cosmopolitanism of the West. This doctrine became the guiding principle of education, censorship, and administration. To enforce this ideology, Nicholas expanded the secret police, officially known as the Third Section of His Imperial Majesty's Chancellery. This organization monitored political dissidents, intellectuals, and even members of the nobility. Informants reported conversations, letters were intercepted, and writers suspected of improper tendencies were censored or exiled. The poet Alexander Pushkin, though allowed to continue writing, lived under constant surveillance. Later, writers such as Mikhail Lermontov and Vissarion Belinsky would clash with the censorship system that stifled public discussion of politics, philosophy, and social reform. The empire under Nicholas was one of contrasts. Outwardly, it appeared powerful, disciplined, and stable. The bureaucracy functioned efficiently, and the army was among the largest in the world. Yet beneath the surface, rigidity and fear hindered progress. Reforms were slow, and innovation was discouraged. The same system that maintained order also suffocated creativity and initiative. Economically, Russia remained overwhelmingly agrarian. Serfdom, the cornerstone of the social order, persisted despite growing recognition of its inefficiency and injustice. The vast estates of the nobility relied on millions of peasants bound to the land, their labor supporting both private wealth and the state's tax base. Some officials, including Nicholas himself, recognized that the system could not last indefinitely. He famously remarked, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until it abolishes itself from below." Yet he hesitated to act decisively, fearing that reform would unleash social chaos. Still, gradual change crept forward. The state sponsored limited industrial development, particularly in the Urals and around St. Petersburg. Railways began to appear, though at a slower pace than in Western Europe. The first major line, connecting St. Petersburg and Moscow, opened in 1851, symbolizing the empire's cautious entry into the modern age. Factories multiplied, cities grew, and a new class of industrial workers slowly emerged, small in number but significant for the future. In foreign policy, Nicholas's reign was marked by both ambition and overreach. He viewed himself as the gendarme of Europe, responsible for maintaining monarchical order against revolution. When uprisings broke out in Poland in 1830 and again in 1846, he crushed them with overwhelming force. The Polish constitution, granted by Alexander I, was abolished, and the kingdom was placed under direct Russian rule. Thousands of rebels were executed or deported to Siberia. The message was clear: any challenge to autocracy, whether at home or abroad, would be met with unyielding repression. This conservative mission extended beyond Russia's borders. Nicholas intervened in Hungary in 1849 to suppress a nationalist revolution against Austrian rule, sending Russian troops across the Carpathians to restore order. His intervention preserved the Habsburg monarchy and earned him the gratitude of Vienna, but it also reinforced his image as the reactionary guardian of the old order. While Europe was moving toward constitutional government and national independence, Russia stood as the bastion of traditional monarchy. Yet Nicholas also pursued imperial expansion, particularly in the Caucasus and Central Asia. The long and brutal Caucasian War, fought against mountain tribes led by leaders such as Imam Shamil, consumed decades of military effort. Russia's forces gradually subdued the region, incorporating the diverse peoples of the Caucasus into the empire. In Central Asia, Russian explorers and soldiers pushed deeper into the steppe, laying the groundwork for future conquest. Despite these successes, Nicholas's foreign policy ultimately overextended Russia's resources and exposed the limits of his system. His greatest failure came in the Crimean War, a conflict that began with lofty ambitions but ended in humiliation. The origins of the war lay in the declining Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe. Nicholas saw himself as the protector of Orthodox Christians within Ottoman territories and sought to extend Russian influence over the Black Sea and the Balkans. In 1853, after diplomatic disputes with Britain and France over control of the holy sites in Palestine, Russian troops occupied the Ottoman provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia. The Ottomans, backed by Britain and France, declared war. What followed revealed the weaknesses of Nicholas's seemingly formidable empire. The Russian army was brave but poorly equipped, its logistics primitive, and its leadership outdated. The Western Allies, with modern navies and industrial support, launched a major campaign against Crimea. The siege of Sevastopol, lasting more than a year, became a test of endurance and technology. Russian soldiers fought heroically, but lacked medical care, supplies, and coordination. Reports of suffering and mismanagement shocked even Nicholas himself. The Crimean War was more than a military defeat for Russia. It was a revelation. When the war began in the year 1853, few in St. Petersburg imagined that the empire of Nicholas I, with its vast armies and centuries of conquest, could be humbled by a coalition of Western powers and the decaying Ottoman Empire. Yet within 3 years, the conflict would expose the weaknesses of Russia's institutions, technology, and leadership, forcing the nation into an age of reform. The war's battles were fought on distant peninsulas, but its consequences would echo through Russian society for generations. The origins of the war lay in the tangled politics of the Near East. The Ottoman Empire, long known as the sick man of Europe, was declining in power. Its territories in the Balkans, the Middle East, and the Black Sea region had become the focus of competing ambitions among the European powers. Nicholas I, who saw himself as the protector of Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule, sought to assert influence over the empire's holy places and secure a privileged role in its affairs. Behind his religious justification lay strategic motives. Control of the Black Sea Straits, the Bosporus and Dardanelles, would grant Russia direct access to the Mediterranean, a goal pursued since the time of Peter the Great. In the early months of 1853, diplomatic tensions escalated. Nicholas sent an envoy to Istanbul demanding recognition of Russia's right to protect Orthodox subjects of the Sultan. The Ottoman government, backed by Britain and France, refused. When negotiations failed, Russian troops crossed the Pruth River and occupied the Ottoman provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia. The Ottoman Empire declared war that autumn. Initially, the conflict seemed a limited regional confrontation. Russian forces under Prince Gorchakov scored early victories along the Danube, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet, commanded by Admiral Nakhimov, destroyed an Ottoman squadron at the Battle of Sinop in November. The annihilation of the Ottoman fleet shocked Europe. Britain and France, fearing that Russian expansion would threaten their interests in the eastern Mediterranean, entered the war on the Ottoman side in the spring of 1854. Their intervention transformed a localized struggle into a major European war. For the first time since the Napoleonic era, The great powers of Western Europe and Russia faced each other in battle. The Allied strategy aimed to neutralize Russia's naval power in the Black Sea by seizing the Crimean Peninsula, where the great naval base of Sevastopol guarded the coast. In September of 1854, a massive Anglo-French force landed near the city of Eupatoria and began its march southward. The campaign would become one of the most grueling in modern military history. The first major engagement came at the Battle of Alma, where Russian troops attempted to block the Allied advance. Poorly led and inadequately equipped, the Russians were overwhelmed by superior firepower and discipline. The defeat forced them to retreat into Sevastopol, which now became the focal point of the war. The Allies settled into a long siege that would last nearly a year. The siege of Sevastopol was unlike any previous conflict in Russian experience. It was a test of industrial warfare fought with modern artillery, steamships, and telegraphs. The city's defenders, led by Admirals Nakhimov, Kornilov, and Istomin, transformed ships' cannons into coastal batteries and used the Black Sea Fleet itself as part of the fortifications. The defense was heroic. For months, Russian soldiers, sailors, and civilians endured bombardments, disease, and hunger. Even when supplies ran short and casualties mounted, they refused to surrender. The Crimean War also became one of the first conflicts in which public opinion and the press played a major role. For the first time, war correspondents sent reports directly from the battlefield. British journalist William Howard Russell's vivid descriptions of mismanagement and suffering shocked readers in London, while photographs taken by Roger Fenton brought the reality of war to the public eye. These innovations marked the dawn of modern war reporting, changing how societies understood conflict. Within Russia, the government attempted to maintain morale, but the contrast between Nicholas I's image of imperial power and the grim reports from Crimea became impossible to ignore. The army that had once marched triumphantly into Paris during Alexander I's reign was now struggling against better armed and better supplied opponents. The logistical system that sustained the Russian army was primitive, relying on horse-drawn wagons over vast distances. Weapons production lagged behind Western standards, and communication between command centers was slow. As the siege dragged on, new battles erupted elsewhere on the peninsula. The British and French won costly victories at Balaclava and Inkerman, but the war was as much a struggle against disease and weather as against the enemy. Cholera, dysentery, and exposure claimed more lives than combat. Among the most famous figures of the war was Florence Nightingale, whose work among British soldiers in field hospitals laid the foundation for modern nursing. For the Russians, the war revealed not only military weakness, but also administrative paralysis. Supplies often failed to reach the front, uniforms and ammunition were scarce, and the medical system collapsed under the strain. In St. Petersburg, Nicholas I grew increasingly despondent. Proud and unyielding, he refused to negotiate peace but could not find a path to victory. Observers described him pacing his palace, consumed by worry for his army and his empire. In February of 1855, he fell ill with pneumonia and died, leaving the throne to his son, Alexander II. The new Tsar inherited not just the war, but a nation on the brink of exhaustion. Determined to end the conflict, Alexander continued the defense of Sevastopol, but soon realized that further resistance was futile. In September of 1855, after nearly a year of siege, the city fell to the Allies. Russian troops withdrew to the north side of the harbor, and the once proud naval base lay in ruins. Peace negotiations began soon after. The Treaty of Paris, signed in March of 1856, brought the war to an end. The terms were harsh, but not catastrophic. Russia was forced to demilitarize the Black Sea, dismantling its naval fortifications and fleet. The Danube was open to international navigation, and the independence of the Ottoman Empire was guaranteed by the European powers. Though Russia retained most of its territory, its prestige suffered a severe blow. The empire that had dominated Europe since the defeat of Napoleon now found itself isolated and humiliated. The Crimean War was a watershed moment in Russian history because it shattered the illusion of invincibility. The defeat exposed the deep structural weaknesses of the state: outdated military organization, backward industry, inefficient bureaucracy, and the crippling burden of serfdom. Russia had entered the war as a giant of the old world, confident in its autocratic strength. It emerged as a nation forced to confront the realities of the modern age. At the same time, the war revealed the resilience of the Russian people. Despite poor leadership and terrible conditions, the soldiers of Sevastopol fought with courage and endurance that impressed even their enemies. The defense of the city became a symbol of national heroism, celebrated in songs, poems, and later in the writings of Leo Tolstoy, who served as a young officer during the siege. The shock of defeat sparked a wave of introspection among Russia's educated classes. Intellectuals, officers, and even members of the government began to ask hard questions. Why had the empire fallen so far behind the West? How could a nation with such vast resources be so vulnerable? The answer, many believed, lay in the system itself. Serfdom, the foundation of Russian society, was seen as both a moral stain and an economic obstacle. Without free labor, industrial progress was impossible. Without education and civic rights, patriotism was hollow. Alexander II, witnessing the devastation of war and the discontent at home, understood that change was unavoidable. In the years that followed, he would launch a series of reforms that aimed to modernize Russia from within, beginning with the emancipation of the serfs. Yet, even as reformers looked ahead, conservatives mourned the passing of the old order. For them, the Crimean War represented not renewal, but decline, a warning that too much openness could weaken the state. When Alexander II took the throne in the spring of 1855, the Russian Empire stood at a crossroads. The Crimean War had ended in humiliation, its armies exhausted and its prestige shattered. The late Nicholas I had left his son an empire that was vast but hollow, an autocratic giant burdened by an outdated social system and a stagnant economy. Alexander inherited not only the crown but also the responsibility to rescue Russia from decline. His reign would become one of the most transformative in Russian history, marked by sweeping reforms, territorial expansion, and the birth of new social forces that would eventually challenge the empire itself. The young Tsar began his rule during the final months of the Crimean War. The once proud fortress of Sevastopol had fallen, and the Russian army, battered and undersupplied, was no match for the combined forces of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Recognizing the futility of continued resistance, Alexander made peace through the Treaty of Paris in 1856. The terms were harsh. Russia was forbidden to maintain a fleet in the Black Sea, and its influence in southeastern Europe was sharply curtailed. Yet the new Tsar treated defeat not as a wound to be avenged, but as a lesson to be learned. "We were beaten not by the strength of our enemies," he told his advisors, "but by our own weakness." From the beginning, Alexander II understood that the empire could not endure without change. Russia's problems were deep and structural: an outdated army, a backward economy, and above all, a social system based on serfdom. The peasantry, bound to the estates of the nobility, formed the backbone of the country's labor force, but had little incentive or means to improve productivity. The moral and practical necessity of reform was clear. As Alexander famously declared, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until it abolishes itself from below." For centuries, the bondage of the Russian serf had been the foundation of imperial life. Millions toiled under conditions that tied them to their landlords as property, unable to move, marry freely, or own land. The arrangement had once provided stability, but by the mid-19th century, it had become an obstacle to progress. Industrialization in Western Europe had shown that free labor and education, not coercion, produced wealth and innovation. The Russian elite knew it, but they feared the social upheaval that freedom might unleash. After several years of study, debate, and negotiation with the landed nobility, Alexander issued the Emancipation Manifesto in 1861. It was an act without precedent in Russian history. More than 20 million serfs were granted personal freedom and the right to own property. They could now marry without permission, engage in commerce, and seek education. Yet, this freedom came at a price. The land they worked had to be purchased from their former owners through state-backed redemption payments, which the peasants were required to repay over decades. Most found themselves burdened with debt and confined to small plots, while the landlords retained much of their best land. Despite its imperfections, the emancipation of the serfs was revolutionary. It broke the centuries-old relationship between lord and peasant, transforming both the rural economy and the moral landscape of the empire. It also set a pattern for reform that would define Alexander's reign. Bold in vision, cautious in execution, and filled with contradictions. The emancipation unleashed changes that demanded further modernization of the state. To manage the new social order, Alexander introduced a series of complementary reforms that reshaped Russian governance. In 1864, he created local assemblies known as zemstvos, elected bodies responsible for education, public health, and local infrastructure. Although dominated by the nobility, the zemstvos represented the first form of local self-government in Russian history. They became training grounds for a new generation of administrators, professionals, and reform-minded intellectuals, the beginnings of a civil society in a land long ruled by decree. The same year brought another landmark reform, a new judicial system that introduced equality before the law, independent courts, and trial by jury. It was a radical departure from the old arbitrary system of secret decrees and corporal punishment. For the first time, ordinary citizens could appeal to impartial judges and public proceedings. The reform also created a professional legal class whose eloquence and commitment to justice became legendary in later Russian culture. Alexander's modernization extended to the military as well. The humiliation of Crimea had demonstrated the need for a modern army. In 1874, the Tsar introduced universal military service, replacing the old system of forced long-term conscription. All classes were now theoretically eligible for service, although the wealthy could still purchase exemptions. The army was restructured, equipped with modern weapons, and trained according to European standards. These changes laid the foundation for the more efficient, professional Russian military that would emerge by the end of the century. The reforms brought progress, but they also exposed contradictions in the empire's structure. While Alexander sought to modernize society, he refused to relinquish the autocratic principle of his rule. The Tsar saw himself as a benevolent reformer, not a constitutional monarch. When advisors suggested establishing a national parliament or granting civil liberties, he declined, fearing that political participation would lead to instability. Russia, he believed, could advance through reform without the need for democracy. At the same time, the empire was expanding outward. Under Alexander II, Russian armies pushed deep into Central Asia, conquering the ancient Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand. These campaigns extended Russia's frontier to the borders of Persia, Afghanistan, and China, bringing vast territories under imperial control. In the east, explorers and settlers moved into Siberia and the Amur Valley, while Alaska, too distant and expensive to defend, was sold to the United States in 1867. These expansions turned Russia into a Eurasian colossus, linking Europe and Asia through military and commercial routes that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. Yet not all fronts brought glory. In 1863, Poland rose in rebellion against Russian rule. The insurrection, driven by nationalist and liberal aspirations, was crushed with brutal efficiency. Thousands were executed or exiled, and the Polish nobility lost their remaining privileges. The Tsar's reaction revealed the limits of his liberalism. He was willing to reform Russia, but not to tolerate dissent or autonomy within the empire. Domestically, the pace of change created new social tensions. The peasantry, though legally free, remained impoverished. Industrialization, though advancing, was uneven and often exploitative. Intellectuals and students, inspired by Western liberalism and socialism, began to question the foundations of autocracy itself. Among them emerged new radical movements that rejected gradual reform and embraced revolution. Groups such as Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, believed that the only path to justice lay through the destruction of the existing order. By the late 1870s, political violence became an alarming feature of Russian life. Officials, police officers, and even members of the royal family were targeted in bombings and assassinations. The state responded with repression, censorship, arrests, and the expansion of the secret police. But the cycle of violence only deepened. Alexander, torn between his reformist instincts and his fear of anarchy, wavered between concession and coercion. Despite the unrest, Russia's international standing improved. The empire regained much of its prestige through victory in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, fought to support Orthodox Christians in the Balkans against Ottoman rule. Russian armies advanced to the outskirts of Constantinople, and the resulting Treaty of San Stefano seemed to crown the Tsar's career with triumph. However, the European powers, alarmed by Russia's growing influence, forced a revision of the treaty at the Congress of Berlin, curtailing many of Russia's gains. The disappointment fed nationalist resentment at home and further eroded faith in the government. By the dawn of the 1880s, Alexander II's position had become precarious. The once revered Tsar liberator was now seen by radicals as a tyrant and by conservatives as weak. In a tragic irony, the man who had freed the serfs would die at the hands of revolutionaries. On a cold March morning in 1881, as his carriage passed along the Catherine Canal in St. Petersburg, assassins from the People's Will attacked. A first bomb exploded without killing him. When Alexander stepped from his carriage to assist the wounded, a second blast struck him down. He died soon after, his body torn and bloodied, the reformer destroyed by the forces his own policies had unleashed. The death of Alexander II in the spring of 1881 sent a shockwave through the Russian Empire. The Tsar liberator, the ruler who had freed millions of serfs and set Russia on a path toward modernization, had been murdered by revolutionaries who claimed to act in the name of the people. His assassination convinced many in power that reform had gone too far, that freedom had bred chaos rather than progress. Into this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty stepped his son, Alexander III, a man who would become the embodiment of reaction and stability. Alexander III was not a man of his father's temperament. Broad-shouldered, imposing, and cautious, he distrusted intellectuals, foreign ideas, and political experimentation. The trauma of his father's death shaped his worldview entirely. To him, the lesson was clear. The empire must be protected not by liberal concessions, but by unyielding authority. Autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality, the triad first proclaimed under Nicholas I, once again became the foundation of imperial policy. The new Tsar began his reign by reversing many of his father's reforms. Within weeks of his coronation, he dismissed liberal ministers, tightened censorship, and expanded the powers of the secret police. The third section, already notorious for its surveillance, was replaced by a new organization, the Okhrana, which became one of the most feared security services in Europe. Its agents infiltrated revolutionary circles, monitored universities, and censored newspapers. The press, which had enjoyed relative freedom under Alexander II, was now subject to pre-publication approval. Editors who dared to criticize the government faced closure or exile. One of Alexander's first acts was to issue the Manifesto on Unshakable Autocracy in the spring of 1881. It declared that the Tsar would rule by divine right, answerable only to God, and rejected any notion of constitutional limitation. This document set the tone for his entire reign, a deliberate retreat from the liberal hopes of the previous era. The Tsar's government also sought to reassert control over local administration. The Zemstvos, the elected local councils created by his father, were placed under the supervision of provincial governors appointed by the crown. Their powers were curtailed, and new laws ensured that the nobility dominated local governance. The urban self-government institutions, known as Duma, faced similar restrictions. Alexander viewed these bodies not as vehicles of civic progress, but as potential sources of disorder. The reactionary turn extended to education. Universities, once centers of intellectual ferment, were brought firmly under state control. The University Statute of 1884 eliminated their autonomy, placed professors under police surveillance, and prohibited political discussion in classrooms. Secondary schools were also restructured to emphasize classical studies and religious instruction, discouraging the growth of technical and scientific education. For the Tsar and his ministers, the purpose of education was to produce loyal subjects, not independent thinkers. Despite his conservatism, Alexander was not indifferent to the material development of the empire. In fact, under his reign, Russia experienced one of the most remarkable periods of industrial growth in its history. The same state that restricted political life invested heavily in economic modernization. The driving force behind this transformation was a group of energetic ministers, foremost among them the finance ministers Nikolai Bungay and Sergei Vita. Bungay, who served during the early years of the reign, introduced measures to improve working conditions and encourage industrial investment. He established the Peasants' Land Bank in 1882 to help former serfs buy land and reduce their debts. Though the bank's resources were limited, it reflected a recognition that the peasant question remained unresolved. Bungay also implemented the empire's first modest labor laws, limiting child labor and setting safety standards for factories. The foundations he laid were expanded under his successor, Ivan Vishnegradsky, and later under Sergei Vita, who would become the chief architect of Russia's industrial age. Vishnegradsky focused on strengthening the empire's finances, increasing taxes, and pushing grain exports to build up gold reserves. His harsh policies contributed to the terrible famine of 1891, which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, yet they left the state fiscally stable and prepared for large-scale investment in infrastructure. One of the defining achievements of Alexander's reign was the beginning of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The idea of linking European Russia with the distant reaches of Siberia had been discussed since the time of Nicholas I, but it was under Alexander III that construction finally began in 1891. Stretching across thousands of miles of forest, steppe, and mountain, the railway symbolized Russia's ambition to bind its continental empire together. It would take more than a decade to complete, but even its early stages opened vast new territories to settlement, trade, and resource extraction. Industrialization also transformed the empire's social landscape. New factories rose in St. Petersburg, Moscow, the Urals, and along the Donbass coal basin. The number of industrial workers grew rapidly, and a modern working class began to emerge. These workers lived in harsh conditions, crowded tenements, long hours, and meager pay, but they also developed a sense of collective identity. The seeds of labor organization and socialism, though still small, began to take root in these years. While industry surged, agriculture remained the foundation of the economy, and it was in the countryside that the contradictions of Alexander's reign were most visible. The peasantry still formed the overwhelming majority of the population, bound by the communal land system established after emancipation. The government sought to maintain control through the mir, the village commune, which collected taxes and managed land distribution. Though it ensured order, it also reinforced backward farming methods and hindered productivity. Famines like that of 1891 exposed the vulnerability of Russia's agrarian system. Nationalism and Russification became defining features of Alexander's domestic policy. The Tsar and his ministers viewed the empire's diversity, its multitude of languages, religions, and ethnicities, as a threat to unity. To strengthen loyalty, they pursued an aggressive campaign to promote Russian language and culture across the empire. In the Baltic provinces, Polish territories, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, local languages were suppressed in schools and administration. The Orthodox Church was encouraged to expand its influence among non-Russian peoples. The Russification Policy also targeted the Jewish population, who were confined to the Pale of Settlement and faced new restrictions on residence, education, and employment. Pogroms, violent attacks on Jewish communities, broke out in several cities in the early 1880s, often with the tacit tolerance of local officials. The government's failure to protect its Jewish citizens darkened Russia's international reputation and drove many to emigrate, particularly to Western Europe and the United States. Foreign policy during Alexander's reign was cautious and defensive. The Tsar, unlike his father, avoided large wars and sought stability in Europe. Relations with Germany remained generally cordial thanks to family ties and shared conservative values, though they became strained toward the end of his reign. In Asia, Russia continued to expand quietly, consolidating control over Central Asia and beginning to extend influence toward the Far East. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway would later make this region a focus of imperial ambition. Despite his reactionary policies, Alexander's reign was not without a certain stability. His emphasis on order and discipline restored confidence after years of upheaval. The bureaucracy functioned more effectively than it had under his predecessors, and the economy's growth created a sense of national strength. The Tsar's personal life reinforced his image as a solid and paternal figure. He lived simply compared to previous monarchs, devoted to his wife, Empress Maria Feodorovna, and their children. To many Russians, he seemed the very embodiment of security after the turbulence of his father's era. Yet beneath the surface, tension was building. Industrialization brought wealth, but also inequality. Urban workers began to voice grievances. Students and intellectuals sought new ways to express opposition to autocracy. Revolutionary groups, though suppressed, survived underground. Even within the bureaucracy, some officials recognized that modernization without political reform could not last forever. When Nicholas II ascended the throne in the autumn of 1894, he was only 26 years old and unprepared for the immense weight of ruling the largest empire on earth. His father, Alexander III, had left him a realm outwardly stable and powerful, but inwardly strained by contradictions. Russia had grown into an industrial and military giant, yet its political system remained frozen in autocracy. Millions of peasants lived in poverty, urban workers toiled in harsh conditions, and revolutionary ideas simmered beneath the surface. The new Tsar inherited not only his father's crown, but also the unsolved question that haunted the Romanovs. How could a modern empire survive under an ancient form of rule? Nicholas was a man of sincerity and devotion, but not of vision. He saw himself as a divinely appointed ruler, bound to preserve the autocracy entrusted to his family. "I shall maintain the principle of absolute power as firmly and unflinchingly as my father," he told his ministers soon after his coronation. Yet the world around him was changing faster than any ruler could control. The final years of the 19th century were marked by rapid industrialization and urban growth. Under the guidance of the finance minister Sergei Witte, Russia's economy expanded at an unprecedented pace. Witte believed that economic modernization was the key to strengthening the empire. He encouraged foreign investment, imposed protective tariffs, and expanded the railway network that Alexander III had begun. The crowning achievement of his program was the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which connected St. Petersburg and Moscow with Vladivostok on the Pacific. This monumental line, stretching thousands of miles, opened up Siberia to settlement, trade, and exploitation of its vast natural resources. Factories multiplied in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the newly industrialized regions of the Donbass and the Urals. Coal, steel, and oil production soared, and Russia became one of the world's leading industrial powers. Yet this growth brought new social tensions. The industrial workforce expanded rapidly, creating a class of urban laborers who endured long hours, poor wages, and unsafe conditions. Peasant migration to the cities disrupted traditional village life, while overcrowding and inequality fueled anger and resentment. Meanwhile, intellectual life was becoming increasingly polarized. The old faith in autocracy gave way among educated Russians to new ideologies: liberalism, socialism, and nationalism. Radical thinkers like Georgy Plekhanov and Vladimir Lenin began to spread Marxist ideas, arguing that the industrial working class would one day overthrow the Tsarist system. These ideas circulated in underground pamphlets, discussion circles, and clandestine organizations, preparing the ground for future revolution. Foreign affairs soon added to the pressures on the regime. In the late 1890s, Russia sought to expand its influence in East Asia. The empire's completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway had given it access to the Pacific, and attention turned to Korea and Manchuria, regions contested by another rising power, Japan. The two nations clashed over control of these territories, and after years of tension, war broke out in 1904. The Russo-Japanese War was meant to be a short, victorious conflict that would strengthen national unity. Instead, it became a disaster. Russian forces, poorly supplied and led, suffered defeat after defeat at the hands of Japan's modern and disciplined army. The fall of Port Arthur and the crushing naval loss at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 humiliated the empire. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian power had defeated a European one, and the psychological shock reverberated across the world. The defeats abroad coincided with growing unrest at home. The economic strain of war, rising food prices, and poor working conditions ignited strikes and protests. The situation exploded in January of 1905, when peaceful demonstrators led by the priest Georgy Gapon marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to petition the Tsar for reform. The Imperial Guards opened fire, killing and wounding hundreds. The massacre, known as Bloody Sunday, shattered the image of the Tsar as the little father who cared for his people. Across Russia, strikes, riots, and mutinies erupted. The year 1905 became one of revolution, the first great upheaval of modern Russia. Workers formed councils, or Soviets, to coordinate strikes. Peasants seized land, and nationalist uprisings broke out in Poland, the Baltic, and the Caucasus. In the Navy, sailors at the battleship Potemkin mutinied, symbolizing the growing defiance of authority. The empire teetered on the brink of collapse. Under immense pressure, Nicholas II was forced to make concessions. In October of 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, drafted largely by Witte, which promised basic civil liberties and the creation of an elected assembly known as the Duma. For the first time in Russian history, the autocracy appeared to yield to the principle of representation. The manifesto temporarily calmed the unrest, and many moderates hoped it would mark the beginning of a constitutional monarchy. However, Nicholas's commitment to reform was reluctant and shallow. He saw the manifesto not as a step toward shared governance, but as a means to preserve his authority. When the First Duma met in 1906, it was dominated by liberals and reformers who demanded land redistribution, political amnesty, and further limitations on royal power. The Tsar, angered by their audacity, dissolved it after only a few months. A second Duma met in 1907 with similar results. Finally, under a new electoral law engineered by the conservative Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, future Duma were stacked in favor of landowners and loyalists. The promise of constitutional government faded into illusion. Despite political repression, Stolypin sought to stabilize the empire through cautious reform. He introduced measures to encourage peasant land ownership, allowing individuals to leave the communal mire system and farm privately. His goal was to create a class of prosperous, loyal farmers, what he called the strong and sober foundation of the state. These reforms achieved some success, but they could not overcome the deep inequalities of rural life. The countryside remained restless, and revolutionary movements continued underground. Meanwhile, Russia entered a period of relative economic recovery. Industrial output rose once more, railways expanded, and foreign investment flowed in. The empire's population surpassed 160 million, making it one of the largest nations in the world. The cities grew rapidly, their skylines filled with factories, warehouses, and new apartment blocks. Yet this growth only widened the gap between rich and poor, between modernity and autocracy. The empire looked strong on the surface, but its foundations were brittle. Culturally, the early 20th century was one of extraordinary creativity. The Silver Age of Russian literature, art, and music flourished. Writers such as Anton Chekhov and Ivan Bunin explored the tensions of modern life. Composers like Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, and later Stravinsky brought Russian music to global prominence. Painters of the Mir Iskustva movement challenged artistic conventions. Beneath the brilliance of this cultural flowering, however, lay a sense of anxiety, a feeling that the old world was nearing its end. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 brought these tensions to their breaking point. Initially, patriotic enthusiasm swept the empire. Crowds filled the streets of St. Petersburg, renamed Petrograd to sound less German, chanting support for the Tsar. Russia entered the war as part of the Allied powers alongside Britain and France, hoping to defend Slavic nations in the Balkans and to restore its international prestige. But the war quickly turned disastrous. The Russian army, vast but poorly equipped, suffered devastating losses against the well-organized German forces. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The home front collapsed under the strain of mobilization. Food shortages, inflation, and transportation breakdowns led to widespread suffering. The government's incompetence and corruption became impossible to ignore. The Tsar made a fateful decision in 1915. He personally assumed command of the army, leaving the capital and placing his German-born wife, Empress Alexandra, in charge of domestic affairs. Her growing reliance on the mystic Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over the royal family became notorious, further discredited the monarchy. Rumors of corruption, treason, and moral decay circulated widely, destroying what remained of public confidence in the regime. By the dawn of 1917, the Russian Empire stood on the edge of collapse. The war that Nicholas II had entered with patriotic confidence had turned into a catastrophe. The armies were broken, the economy was in ruins, and the people were starving. In the cities, workers and soldiers were united in anger. In the countryside, peasants seized estates and refused to obey officials. The centuries-old structure of autocracy, already weakened by reform, industrialization, and social unrest, finally gave way. What followed was not a single revolution, but a sequence of upheavals that would sweep away the old order, unleash civil war, and give birth to a new kind of state, the Soviet Union. The spark came in February of 1917 in Petrograd, the imperial capital that had once symbolized Russia's might and modernity. It began as a protest over bread shortages. Women queued for hours outside bakeries, demanding food for their families. Workers joined the demonstrations, and within days, the city was in turmoil. Factories shut down, public transport halted, and the police lost control. When troops were ordered to fire on the crowds, many refused and instead joined the protesters. The mutiny spread rapidly, and soon, entire regiments declared their support for the uprising. On the 12th of March, the Duma, Russia's elected legislature, formed a provisional committee to restore order and take control. At the same time, workers and soldiers established a Soviet, or council, representing their own interests. The capital now had two centers of power, each claiming legitimacy. The Romanov dynasty, isolated and discredited, had no means of regaining control. On the 15th of March, Nicholas II abdicated the throne, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. He hoped his brother, Grand Duke Michael, would succeed him, but Michael refused, declaring that he would only accept power if confirmed by a constituent assembly. With that, the Russian monarchy ceased to exist. The new provisional government, led by liberal politicians such as Prince Georgy Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky, promised democracy, civil rights, and a constitution. Its leaders were men of education and principle, inspired by Western ideals of parliamentary government. They abolished the death penalty, granted freedom of speech and assembly, and pledged to convene an elected constituent assembly to determine the nation's future. For a moment, Russia seemed poised to join the ranks of modern democratic states. But the reality outside Petrograd was far less orderly. The empire was still at war, and the army was disintegrating. Soldiers deserted in the hundreds of thousands, weary of fighting and unwilling to die for a government that could not feed them. In the countryside, peasants seized the land of landlords, redistributing it through local committees. National minorities across the empire, Finns, Poles, Ukrainians, and peoples of the Caucasus and Central Asia, demanded autonomy or independence. The empire, already fragile, began to fracture. Meanwhile, the Petrograd Soviet, composed of workers, soldiers, and socialist intellectuals, grew increasingly powerful. Its slogan, "All power to the Soviets," challenged the very existence of the provisional government. The dual power arrangement that emerged in the spring of 1917 was inherently unstable. The provisional government held formal authority, but the Soviets held the loyalty of the masses and the army. Into this volatile situation stepped the Bolsheviks, a radical faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party led by Vladimir Lenin. Exiled in Switzerland since before the war, Lenin returned to Petrograd in April with the help of Germany, which saw him as a weapon to destabilize its enemy. His arrival electrified the revolutionary movement. In his April theses, Lenin called for an immediate end to the war, the transfer of land to the peasants, and all power to the Soviets. He denounced the provisional government as a tool of the bourgeoisie and insisted that only a dictatorship of the proletariat could fulfill the revolution's promise. Throughout the summer, Russia drifted deeper into chaos. The provisional government tried to continue the war, launching a final offensive in June that ended in disaster. Soldiers mutinied and discipline collapsed. Economic conditions worsened, strikes multiplied, and prices soared. In July, mass demonstrations erupted in Petrograd, demanding that the Soviets seize power. The uprising, later known as the July Days, was suppressed, and the Bolsheviks were briefly driven underground. Lenin fled to Finland, while many of his followers were arrested. Yet the tide soon turned again. In August, a conservative general, Lavur Kornilov, attempted to march on Petrograd and restore military authority. The provisional government, desperate to defend itself, armed the city's workers and relied on the Soviets to organize resistance. The coup collapsed, but its failure destroyed what little confidence remained in the government. The Bolsheviks, having played a key role in stopping Kornilov, emerged as heroes of the revolution. By the autumn of 1917, the Bolsheviks had gained majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Their message of peace, land, and bread resonated deeply with war-weary soldiers, hungry workers, and land-hungry peasants. On the 25th of October, according to the old Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks moved to seize power. Under the leadership of Lenin and Leon Trotsky, armed Red Guards stormed key government buildings in Petrograd, including the Winter Palace. The ministers of the provisional government were arrested with little resistance. The revolution was remarkably swift and almost bloodless in the capital. The next day, Lenin announced the formation of a new government, the Council of People's Commissars, with himself as chairman. The Bolsheviks' victory in Petrograd did not immediately give them control over all Russia. In many regions, rival factions refused to recognize their authority. Civil war erupted almost at once. On one side stood the Bolsheviks, or Reds, determined to consolidate their socialist revolution. On the other stood a diverse coalition of monarchists, liberals, nationalists, and foreign-backed forces, the Whites, who sought to restore order or re-establish a non-Bolshevik government. The Russian Civil War, which raged from 1918 to 1921, was one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history. It was not merely a struggle between armies, but a war that consumed the entire society. The front lines stretched from the Baltic to Siberia, from the Caucasus to the Arctic. Entire cities changed hands multiple times, villages were burned, railways destroyed, and millions displaced. Lenin and the Bolsheviks acted with ruthless determination. They created the Red Army, led by Trotsky, who imposed strict discipline and reorganized the shattered remnants of the Imperial Army. To suppress opposition, the regime established the Cheka, a secret police force that carried out arrests, executions, and campaigns of terror against perceived enemies. Under a policy known as war communism, the government seized grain from peasants, nationalized industry, and banned private trade. These measures enabled the Bolsheviks to supply their armies, but caused widespread famine and resentment. The white forces, meanwhile, were divided by geography, ideology, and foreign intervention. British, French, American, and Japanese troops landed in various parts of the former empire to support anti-Bolshevik armies. But their assistance was inconsistent and self-interested. The whites failed to unite under a single command, and their reputation was tarnished by brutality and reactionary policies. Gradually, the Red Army gained the upper hand. By 1920, the Bolsheviks had crushed most organized resistance. The last major white stronghold, led by General Wrangel in Crimea, fell that year. The following year, the Red Army defeated nationalist forces in Ukraine and the remnants of foreign intervention. The war left the country devastated. Cities lay in ruins, industry had collapsed, and millions had died from battle, famine, and disease. Yet, out of this chaos, a new state emerged. In December of 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally established, uniting Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics under one federal structure. The new government proclaimed itself the heir of the revolution, dedicated to building a classless society. In reality, it was a centralized one-party state ruled by the Communist Party. The ideals of democracy and freedom that had animated the early revolution were replaced by authoritarian control and the beginnings of a new kind of empire. One not of czars and nobles, but of party officials and commissars. The fall of the Russian Empire was one of the most dramatic transformations in world history. In less than 5 years, a monarchy that had ruled for centuries collapsed. The largest empire on earth disintegrated, and a revolutionary regime claiming to represent the workers and peasants took its place. The old world of palaces, nobles, and serfs was gone, replaced by a new order born in violence and conviction. When the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially proclaimed in December of 1922, few could yet grasp how profoundly it would reshape the legacy of the fallen Russian Empire. Outwardly, it appeared as a new beginning, a federation of workers' and peasants' republics built on the ashes of monarchy, privilege, and exploitation. Its leaders promised that the old structures of oppression had been swept away, that equality and collective ownership would replace hierarchy and private power. Yet beneath the language of revolution, many continuities endured. The Soviet Union inherited not only the geography of the Russian Empire, but also its centralized traditions, its imperial frontiers, and its enduring obsession with control and security. The early years of the new state were marked by exhaustion and reconstruction. The Civil War had left the country devastated. Industrial output had fallen to a fraction of its pre-war level. Transportation networks were in ruins, and famine had killed millions. The population, traumatized by years of violence, faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives under a regime still uncertain of its future. Lenin, who had led the Bolsheviks to victory, now faced the monumental task of transforming revolutionary ideals into a functioning government. Recognizing the need for recovery, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, or NEP, in the spring of 1921, even before the formal establishment of the Soviet Union. The policy represented a pragmatic retreat from the harsh measures of war communism. It allowed limited private trade, restored small-scale industry to individual ownership, and permitted peasants to sell surplus grain on the market after paying a tax in kind. For the first time since the revolution, markets reappeared in towns and villages, and commerce revived. The NEP succeeded in stabilizing the economy, bringing modest prosperity to urban centers and easing rural tensions. But the compromise also created new contradictions. The re-emergence of private enterprise gave rise to a small but visible class of traders and entrepreneurs known as nepmen. To the Bolsheviks, who had fought for a classless society, their success seemed a betrayal of socialist principles. Lenin defended the policy as a temporary measure, a strategic retreat necessary for survival. But many within the Communist Party regarded it as heresy. Lenin's health deteriorated sharply after a series of strokes beginning in 1922. As he withdrew from active leadership, a struggle for power emerged within the upper ranks of the party. The contest was not merely personal, it was a battle over the future direction of the revolution. On one side stood Leon Trotsky, the brilliant organizer of the Red Army, who advocated for rapid industrialization and the spread of world revolution. On the other stood Joseph Stalin, the party's general secretary, a position that gave him control over appointments and internal organization. Stalin's strength lay not in oratory or ideology, but in methodical power building. When Lenin died in January of 1924, the party honored him as the father of the revolution. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Red Square, where it would remain for decades, a symbol of secular sainthood. Yet his passing left the movement without a moral compass. In the years that followed, Stalin skillfully outmaneuvered his rivals, forming alliances and breaking them as needed. By the end of the decade, Trotsky had been expelled from the party and exiled abroad, and Stalin stood as the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's rise marked the beginning of a new phase in Russian history. The revolutionary dream of a society built on voluntary cooperation and equality gave way to a regime of coercion, industrial might, and ideological conformity. The transformation he led was immense, turning a predominantly agrarian country into an industrial superpower within a generation. But the cost was measured in millions of lives. In 1928, Stalin launched the first five-year plan, an ambitious program to modernize the economy through rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. The state set production targets for every sector, from steel and coal to machinery and textiles. Gigantic factories rose in the Urals and Siberia, new cities were built, and workers were mobilized in vast construction projects such as the Dnieper hydroelectric station and the Moscow metro. Propaganda celebrated the achievements of labor heroes who exceeded their quotas, portraying them as models of socialist devotion. The industrialization drive succeeded in creating the foundations of heavy industry, but it relied on harsh discipline and near-total state control. Labor mobility was restricted, and failure to meet quotas could result in punishment. Meanwhile, collectivization, the forced consolidation of individual peasant farms into large state-run or collective farms, unleashed catastrophe in the countryside. Millions of peasants resisted the loss of their land and livestock, only to face brutal repression. The state labeled them kulaks, or wealthy peasants, and declared them enemies of socialism. Between 1929 and 1933, collectivization and the accompanying requisition of grain led to widespread famine, particularly in Ukraine, where millions perished. The tragedy, known as the Holodomor, remains one of the darkest episodes of the 20th century. Entire villages starved, while the state continued to export grain to meet industrialization goals. The suffering of the peasants was hidden behind a facade of progress. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union had indeed become a modern industrial power. Its factories produced steel, tractors, and weapons on a scale unmatched in its history. Urban populations swelled, literacy rates rose dramatically, and scientific education expanded. Yet this progress came at the price of unprecedented repression. Stalin's consolidation of power culminated in the Great Purges of the late 1930s, a campaign of political terror aimed at eliminating all real or imagined enemies. The secret police, now called the NKVD, carried out mass arrests, forced confessions, and executions. Party officials, military commanders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens alike were accused of treason or counter-revolutionary activity. Show trials in Moscow dramatized the supposed conspiracies of former Bolshevik leaders who were publicly humiliated before being executed. Millions were sent to labor camps, the Gulag, where they endured starvation, disease, and death in the frozen wilderness of Siberia. The purges destroyed the generation that had made the revolution and created an atmosphere of pervasive fear. Yet Stalin emerged stronger than ever. His image was exalted to near-deity status. His portrait hung in factories, schools, and homes. His speeches were memorized and recited as if sacred text. The cult of personality replaced the collective leadership that Lenin had envisioned. Despite the terror, the Soviet Union's transformation under Stalin was undeniable. By the late 1930s, it had become a centralized, industrialized, and militarized state capable of rivaling the great powers of the world. The empire of the czars had been replaced by an empire of ideology, one that sought not hereditary legitimacy but historical destiny. In foreign policy, Stalin's regime walked a precarious line between isolation and engagement. The Soviet Union joined the League of Nations in 1934, seeking international recognition, yet suspicion of the capitalist world remained deep. Meanwhile, Stalin extended control over the non-Russian republics within the Union, suppressing local languages and cultures in favor of a unified Soviet identity. While officially a federation, the USSR was in practice a highly centralized empire dominated by Moscow. As the decade progressed, the clouds of another great war began to gather over Europe. The rise of fascism in Italy and Germany posed a new threat, both ideological and strategic. At first, the Soviet Union sought collective security with Western democracies, but mutual distrust prevailed. In August of 1939, Stalin stunned the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The agreement allowed Hitler to invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention, triggering the Second World War. When Germany invaded Poland from the west, Soviet forces entered from the east, annexing the eastern territories of Poland and later occupying the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The borders of the Soviet Union expanded once more, echoing the territorial reach of the old Russian Empire. For the first time since the revolution, Russia's imperial geography had been largely restored, but under a new banner. The pact with Germany was one of cynical calculation, buying Stalin time to strengthen his defenses. Yet, it would not last. In June of 1941, Hitler betrayed his ally and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. German armies poured into Soviet territory, advancing rapidly and inflicting massive losses. Entire regions fell, millions were captured or killed, and the Soviet state faced its greatest test since its creation. The invasion would transform the Soviet Union once again, turning it from a revolutionary power into a nation fighting for survival. The coming years of war, what Russians would call the Great Patriotic War, would forge a new sense of unity and sacrifice, rooted not in ideology, but in the defense of homeland. The empire that had fallen in 1917 had now been reborn in another form. The Soviet state was at once a continuation and a transformation of the Russian imperial tradition, centralized, vast, and driven by the conviction of historical mission. Its capital was no longer the court of the czars, but the Kremlin of the party. Its ruler no longer divine by blood, but absolute by ideology. Absolute by ideology.